She didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't drop to her knees when the Alpha King looked her in the eye and chose his throne over her. She stood there in front of thousands while he stripped her name, her bond, her entire identity. And she let him. Because she already knew something he didn't. The woman you exiled doesn't disappear. She evolves. Stay with me until the end of this story, and you'll understand why the most dangerous person in any kingdom isn't the one wearing the crown. It's the one you were stupid enough to throw away. Drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Let's ride. The morning they destroyed her, the sky was the color of an open wound. Seraphina noticed that first, not the crowd assembled in the Thornwall courtyard, not the row of silver-armored royal guards flanking the obsidian dais, not even the noble council seated in their carved mahogany chairs like a row of judges who'd already signed the verdict before the trial began. She noticed the sky, a sick, bruised amber bleeding out toward the east, the kind of dawn that felt less like a beginning and more like something dying slow. She'd been awake since the second bell. Hadn't slept. Couldn't. The cold of the castle's lower holding rooms had a specific quality. Damp stone and iron, and the particular silence of a place where people came to wait for terrible things. She'd stood at the single barred window for 5 hours, watching the courtyard below fill with faces. Common people. Pack members from every district in the Blackthorn territory. Merchants and smiths and farmers who'd traveled half a week to witness this. The royal summons had gone out 3 days prior. The Alpha King requests the presence of the realm at a matter of justice and crown security. They hadn't told her what specifically. They hadn't needed to. She knew what a public execution of character looked like. She'd studied history long enough. When they came to collect her at dawn, there were 6 of them. Royal Guard, full ceremonial plate, the silver and black crest of House Blackthorn hammered into their breastplates. The lead guard, a man named Aldrich, who she'd once sparred with in the training yard, who'd laughed at her footwork and called her quick, didn't meet her eyes when he unlatched her cell. "Aldrich," she said. He stared at the wall behind her left ear. "Luna Seraphina, it's time." She walked out ahead of them without being asked. She wasn't going to let them escort her like a prisoner if she could help it. She was still Luna. That title still sat on her shoulders, and she intended to carry it all the way to the moment they pried it off her, because it was hers, and she had earned it, and she would not surrender it 1 second earlier than she absolutely had to. The walk through the castle's inner corridors took 9 minutes. She counted every step. She cataloged the faces of the servants who pressed back against the stone walls as she passed, some looking at the floor, some looking at her with something that might have been pity or might have been curiosity, a few with that specific blankness that meant they'd been told not to react. She memorized every single one. Not out of anger, out of habit. Seraphina Voss had been cataloging the faces of rooms since she was 7 years old, reading the temperature of every space she entered, learning which people were watching and which were hiding and which were doing both at the same time. It had kept her alive in the noble courts. It had served her as Luna. It would serve her again. The courtyard hit her like a wall of sound the moment the outer doors opened. Thousands of people, pressed 6 and 7 deep against the iron barriers lining the perimeter. The hum of that many bodies close together made the air vibrate differently, a pressure Seraphina felt in her sternum as she stepped down the granite steps and into the open. The guards fell into formation around her, not touching, not yet, and she walked the center path between parted crowds toward the obsidian dais at the far end. She kept her chin level, eyes forward. She'd dressed herself that morning in the deep burgundy gown she'd worn to her first formal council appearance 2 years ago. No embellishment, no extra jewelry, nothing performative. She wanted to look exactly like what she was, a woman who belonged here. Alpha King Darius Blackthorn was already on the dais when she arrived. She let herself look at him for exactly 3 seconds. That was all she allowed. He was wearing full formal regalia, the obsidian crown, the ceremonial black and silver cloak, the signet ring of House Blackthorn on his right hand. He stood with his shoulders squared and his jaw set, and that look on his face she'd learned to read early, the one where he'd already decided, and the performance happening now was exactly that. A performance. For the crowd. For the council. For whoever was going to write this in the historical record. 3 years. She had stood beside this man for 3 years, and she had believed, not blindly, not stupidly, she had evidence, she had every reasonable basis for believing, that when it mattered, he would look at her rather than at the room. He was looking at the room. She stepped up onto the dais without being guided and positioned herself 4 feet to his left. The council of noble lords sat in their carved chairs in a curved row facing the crowd. 12 men. She knew each of their names, their house affiliations, their land holdings, their debts, their appetites. Lord Cassius Vane sat at the center, his silver-streaked hair swept back and his expression serene in the specific way of men who've already won and are enjoying the formality of confirmation. Beside him, Lord Hector Morn studied his own hands. Lord Aldrin Thatch picked something invisible from his sleeve. They didn't look at her either. The High Herald stepped forward and read the formal charges. His voice was trained to carry, and it did, reaching every corner of that courtyard without effort. Be it known before the Crown and the assembled people of Blackthorn territory. Luna Seraphina. Voss has been charged with the crime of high treason against the Alpha King and the realm. Specifically, conspiracy with rogue elements operating within the eastern border territories to undermine Crown authority and destabilize the territorial pact sworn to House Blackthorn. Evidence produced before the Noble Council has been reviewed and confirmed. The charges have been upheld. There was no sound from the crowd, the specific silence of thousands of people holding their breath at the same time. Seraphina felt her heartbeat in her throat. Steady. Fast, but steady. She would not look at the ground. She would not look at Cassius Vane, because if she looked at Cassius Vane, she might do something that ended this wrong, and she needed to survive this moment to address the rest of them. She looked at Darius. He was looking slightly above her head. "Your Majesty," she said. Her voice carried. She hadn't planned it that way. Or maybe she had, some instinct beneath conscious decision operating separately. Thousands of people heard it. Darius's jaw tightened fractionally. "Luna Seraphina," he said. "The council has—" "I know what the council said." She kept her voice even, not raised, not emotional. "I know what charges they brought and what evidence they claim to have. I am asking you, in front of these people, to look at me and tell me whether you believe it." The silence stretched. Someone in the crowd coughed. A child said something too quietly to hear. Darius looked at her. Finally, actually looked. And for 1 second she thought she saw it. That fracture line she knew existed somewhere behind his eyes. The place where he was still a man rather than just a king. Then it closed. "The council's evidence was reviewed according to Crown law," he said. "The decision has been made." "That's not an answer," Seraphina said. "It is the answer I'm giving you." Her chest cracked. Not dramatically. Not in any way visible to the crowd. Just a clean, quiet fracture along something she hadn't known she was still holding on to. "Then at minimum," she said, "tell me what the evidence was. Because I don't know what I allegedly did, Darius, and I have the right—" "You forfeited those rights under the treason charter." Lord Cassius Vane's voice slid smoothly into the gap. "Luna Seraphina, the legal process has concluded. We are here for the sentencing." She looked at him then, directly, long enough that his serene expression flickered almost imperceptibly at the edges. "Lord Vane," she said, "I'll speak to the Alpha King." "The Alpha King has spoken. He said 5 words about Crown law." She kept her voice absolutely level. "I'm asking for the courtesy of a direct conversation with my Seraphina." Darius's voice came sharp, low, the sound of a man who'd just made a decision that hurt and was forcing himself past it. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The courtyard was completely silent. She heard her own breathing. She heard the wind moving through the high towers of Thornwall Castle and the distant sound of the market district beyond the outer walls. Normal life continuing at its own speed, indifferent to what was happening in this courtyard. She heard Darius's guard shift his weight on the granite and the dry rustling of the herald's formal papers. "Make it harder," she said quietly. "For who?" He didn't answer. The herald stepped forward and began reading the sentencing. "By the authority of Alpha King Darius Blackthorn and the noble council of the Blackthorn realm, the following sentence is hereby declared. Luna Serafina Voss is stripped of the title of Luna and all ranks, privileges, and protections therein. The mate bond between Alpha King Darius Blackthorn and Serafina Voss is formally severed in accordance with royal prerogative. The former Luna is hereby banished from the Blackthorn territories and all lands under Crown Treaty, effective immediately upon this declaration. She may not return under penalty of death. Her name is struck from all official records of House Blackthorn. The words landed like stones dropped into water. Serafina felt each one. The severance of the bond didn't come with ceremony or magic or any visible sign. It was just a decision, and then it was done, because that was all it had ever required on his side. She felt something shift in her chest cavity, a pressure, like something load-bearing had just been quietly removed. Not pain exactly. Not yet. The pain would come later, in some cold place without witnesses, and she already knew that. This moment was not for pain. This moment was for standing. She stood. She stood while the herald finished reading. She stood while the silence extended across the courtyard and then broke under the sound of murmuring, low and rippling, and impossible to identify as one thing or another. Shock, judgment, sympathy, satisfaction. She couldn't tell, and she wasn't going to try to read it. She stood while Cassius Vane sat back in his carved chair with the expression of a man settling into a comfortable evening, while Aldrin Thatch studied his sleeve again, while Hector Morn finally looked at her with something in his face she couldn't decipher. She stood and looked at Darius one more time. He was watching the crowd now, his profile to her. The obsidian crown caught the sick amber light of that early sky and threw no reflection. He looked like what he was. A king, solid and certain and contained. The most dangerous thing about grief, Serafina thought in that moment, was how much it could resemble dignity from the outside. Then she turned, without being escorted, without waiting for direction, and walked off the dais. The path through the crowd seemed longer walking out than it had coming in. She kept the same pace. Chin level, eyes tracking forward. She was aware of every face in her peripheral vision, aware of the children being lifted up to see, aware of the woman near the iron barrier pressing her hands together in front of her mouth like a prayer, aware of the old man in the second row who removed his hat and held it against his chest as she passed. Not in honor, just in some wordless acknowledgement of witnessing. She made it to the outer gate before her legs tried to stop working. She didn't let them. The castle's outer road was empty. The guards at the gate stood aside without touching her. One of them, young, barely older than 20, had water in his eyes. She didn't look at him long enough to see it fall. They took her horse and her crown gear at the east checkpoint, left her with her riding clothes, the coat she was wearing, a single pack. She understood why. They didn't want to be seen executing a woman publicly. This was cleaner. Let the rogue territories do it. The checkpoint guard, an older man with a scar running the length of his chin, handed her the pack without making eye contact. The Eastern Road, he said. Beyond the territorial border markers, Blackthorn jurisdiction ends. After that, he stopped. After that, you're not responsible, Serafina said. He said nothing. She took the pack and walked east. She walked for 3 hours before she allowed herself to stop. The road narrowed and then dissolved entirely about an hour past the border markers, becoming a game trail through dense pine forest, the ground gone soft with old needles and the smell of earth and wet stone. She stopped beside a creek she didn't know the name of, set the pack down on a moss-covered boulder, and sat. For a while she didn't think anything at all. Then she opened the pack and cataloged it, methodically. 4 days of dried rations, a skin for water, a folding knife, good steel. They hadn't given her garbage. She'd give them that. A flint kit, 1 blanket, no maps. Of course, no maps. She filled the water skin from the creek and drank half of it without stopping. Then she sat with her back against the boulder and let herself feel it. It was not what she'd expected. She'd expected rage. She had ample reason for it. She had the specific burning fury of a person who'd been framed cleanly and completely and watched every mechanism she should have been able to reach for simply not reach back. She'd expected to want to scream or destroy something or weep until she couldn't breathe. Instead, she felt something quieter, cold, specific, like standing in a room after a fire has burned through it. The heat is gone, There's nothing left to burn, and what you're looking at is just structure, framework, what remains. This is what you have, she thought. The knife, the food, the coat, the water. 4 days. She was a fast learner. That was always true. She had always, since childhood, been the girl who didn't need to be told a thing twice. Who are you? She asked herself, sitting by that creek with her back against cold stone, without the title. The answer came back immediately, the way real answers did when you stopped trying to perform them. The same person who built the title in the first place. She stood, picked up the pack, looked at the tree line to the east where the rogue territories started in earnest, and the rules changed, and there was nothing between her and whatever happened next except herself. She started walking. The first week was brutal, and she didn't pretend otherwise. The rogue territories weren't simply ungoverned. They were actively inhospitable to anyone who didn't already know the terrain. The pack territories nested within the apparent emptiness, the unmarked boundaries where one outcast group's grudging claim ended and another's began. She made mistakes. She walked into what turned out to be contested ground between two groups she later learned were called the Ashcroft Remnants and the Grafin Wanderers, and she talked her way out of it through an exhausting hour of negotiation that ran entirely on the combination of her ability to read a room and the fact that she clearly had nothing worth taking. She got rained on for 36 consecutive hours. She twisted her ankle on a rock slide and kept walking with it because stopping wasn't an option. She slept light and ate less than she should have until she figured out the creek lines and the difference between edible and not edible in this specific region. And when she found her first viable campsite, elevated ground, defensible approach, water access within 200 feet, she stayed there for 4 days and let herself recover and think. She thought about Cassius Vane, Lord Cassius Vane, head of the second most powerful noble house in the Blackthorn realm. 6 years on the noble council. Land holdings in 3 of the 7 districts. 2 unmarried daughters and 1 son placed in the military. A man who had smiled at her across dinner tables and laughed at appropriate moments, and never once been anything except smooth and cooperative and absolutely opaque. She'd known he didn't like her. She hadn't known the scale of it. She thought about what he'd needed her to be guilty of. Treason with rogue elements in the Eastern Territories. It was elegantly chosen. She could admit that. It pointed at the part of the realm where crown authority was already weakest, already a source of anxiety for Darius, already the subject of war council discussions she'd sat in on for 2 years. It made her complicit in exactly the thing the Alpha King was most afraid of losing control over. It gave him no room to doubt without appearing weak, and it left no visible trace back to whoever had constructed it. She thought about Darius. She stopped thinking about Darius. On the 12th day past the border, she found the hollow camp. She almost missed it. It sat in a depression between 2 ridgelines that effectively hid it from the main trail, and she'd have walked past without seeing if she hadn't smelled the smoke. She approached carefully, made noise on purpose when she was 20 yards out so she wouldn't startle anyone, and waited. A woman appeared at the camp's rough perimeter carrying a spear. Mid-30s, dark-skinned, lean, in the way of people who'd been working with too little for too long. Her eyes ran a fast assessment over Seraphina's coat, her pack, her empty hands. "State your business," the woman said. "Looking for water access and willing to trade for it," Seraphina said. 3 days of dried rations. I'm passing through." "Where you headed?" "East." The woman's expression said she recognized the non-answer and was deciding how much energy it was worth pressing it. "Name?" she asked. Seraphina thought about what she was going to do with that question for the rest of her life and answered it for the first time. "Sarah," she said. "Just Sarah." The woman studied her for another moment. "Kael," she said finally, "you look like you've been out here about 2 weeks and running on stubbornness." 13 days, Seraphina said. The stubbornness estimate's accurate. Something crossed the woman's face that might have been a smile. "Come in. We'll see about the water." The hollow camp had 11 people. She learned that in the first hour. 3 families in various configurations, a couple with 2 small children, an older man and his grown son, 2 sisters, and 4 individuals who'd attached to the group separately over the past months. They were quiet around her at first, the wariness of people who'd been in open territory long enough to know that strangers were risk by default. She did what she always did. She sat. She listened. She asked questions when it was appropriate and not when it wasn't. By the end of the second day, she knew most of their stories, because people who'd been cast out had stories that needed to be told and rarely found anyone willing to hear them. Kael had been the beta of a northern pack before the Alpha's son decided her council was a threat and had her expelled on a charge that everyone in the pack knew was false and no one did anything about. The older man, Grice, had been born in the rogue territories and had never had pack affiliation. The two sisters, Marin and Jossie, had fled a border pack after their father's death left them unprotected, and the new Alpha viewed them as assets to be distributed. Each story was its own specific version of the same architecture: power used without accountability, systems that existed to protect people quietly removed from anyone inconvenient enough to use them, and then the open territory waiting on the other side with no compass and no instruction. Serafina recognized the architecture. She offered to stay and help with camp maintenance in exchange for extended water access. Kael said 3 more days. She stayed 3 days, then 2 more, then a week, and somewhere in that time, the question of her leaving stopped being asked. She started teaching Kael's group things that turned out to be useful. Not because she had any grand vision, she was too practical for grand visions in those early weeks, too occupied with surviving, but because she had knowledge they didn't, and it would have been a waste not to use it. She knew field medicine, properly treated the older man's infected cut on his palm before it got worse, showed Marin how to identify septic wound signs. She knew negotiation and territory psychology well enough to sketch out a buffer strategy for dealing with the 2 surrounding rogue camps that had been sources of ongoing low-level conflict. She knew how to set a watch rotation that didn't exhaust the people keeping it. Within 3 weeks, the camp ran differently. She noticed with interest that nobody had asked her to do any of this. She'd simply started doing it, and people had either learned or joined, or both. "You're not what you said you were," Kael told her one evening. They were sitting at the outer edge of the camp, fire behind them, darkness ahead. Kael had learned, Serafina had noticed, to do her talking sideways when she wanted to get at something true. "I said I was just Sarah passing through east," Serafina replied. "First part's still accurate." "Where'd you learn the medicine?" "I've been around people who needed it." "Where'd you learn the watch rotation?" Serafina was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. Somewhere out in the dark, something moved through underbrush and was still again. "I had teachers," she said. "Before." Kael absorbed this. "Before what?" "Before I was just Sarah." Another long pause. "I'm not going to ask what they did to you," Kael said, "or what they called you. None of my business and none of this camp's business. But I will say—" She stopped, then continued in a different tone, quieter and more direct. "Whatever you're building in your head, I see you building it. Whatever you're planning, I want in." Serafina looked at her. "I don't have a plan," she said, which was mostly true. She had fragments, the early shapes of something that hadn't yet declared itself clearly enough to be called a plan. "I know," Kael said. "I'm not asking for a plan. I'm asking to be there when you have one." That was the first conversation. There were others. Over the following 4 months, Serafina moved camp twice. Both times, for strategic reasons she explained fully to everyone affected, and both times the group moved with her. The second move brought them into contact with a larger cluster of rogue families camped along a river tributary, 40-odd people who'd been managing on their own for years and had developed a rough internal structure that worked mostly except for the problems it couldn't solve. Food security in winter. Medical needs it couldn't address. Defense against a territorial pack to the northwest that periodically tested their perimeter. Serafina spent 2 weeks just watching. Then she asked to speak with whoever was in charge. The man who came to meet her was called Brant. He was approximately 50, built like a forge anvil, and deeply skeptical of anyone who arrived at his camp with nothing but competence and a request for an audience. "I've seen 7 people like you in the past decade," he said. He said it pleasantly, which was somehow more discomfiting than hostility. "People who showed up with big ideas and good teeth and told us they had something worth hearing. 6 of them wanted something from us. 1 genuinely meant it and still left after winter because this life is hard and ideas don't fix that. I know this life is hard, Serafina said. I've been in it 7 months. 7 months is nothing. I know that too. She didn't argue it. I'm not asking you to follow me anywhere. I'm asking you to listen to what I'm seeing about your Northwest problem and tell me whether it's accurate. Brant's eyes narrowed fractionally. What you're seeing? Your Northwest problem. The pack that tests your perimeter. I've watched your responses over 2 weeks, and I think you have 3 structural gaps that they've identified and are waiting for the right season to use. I could be wrong, but if I'm right, you should probably know. A long pause. Talk, he said. She talked for 45 minutes. She laid out exactly what she'd observed. The patrol patterns, the pressure points in the perimeter response, the timing and frequency of the incursions. And then she offered 3 adjustments, none of which required resources Brant's camp didn't already have. She kept her language clean and direct. No promises she couldn't keep. No exaggeration of what she knew versus what she was inferring. When she finished, Brant was quiet for a while. Who taught you this? He said. War Council briefings, she said. For 2 years. His expression changed very slightly. You were inside. I was. What happened? The people who benefit from frontier instability decided I knew too much about what causes it. Another long silence. Brant looked at the river, looked at his camp, looked at her. You can stay, he said. We'll see what your adjustments do. They reduced incursion attempts by over half within 6 weeks. By the end of the first year, Serafina had stopped thinking about what she'd lost and started thinking about what she was building. The distinction mattered, not morally, but functionally. The way the direction you face determines what you can see. Looking backward at the Thornwall courtyard and the obsidian crown and Darius's profile in that sick amber light, there was nothing actionable there. Looking forward at the 40 families stretched across 3 riverside camps that had started, tentatively and without ceremony, to recognize her as the person who made things work. That was material. She called herself Sarah in those camps. She let the rest of it stay buried. She learned the rogue territories the way she'd learned the noble court, patiently, specifically, without assumptions. She mapped the informal networks, the lines of communication and resource sharing that existed underneath the apparent chaos. She found the pain points, the families with medical needs they couldn't address, the camps with food security problems solvable with different storage approaches, the ongoing conflicts between neighboring groups that persisted mostly because no one had ever sat both parties down and made them articulate what they actually needed, rather than what they were fighting about. She addressed each problem directly and practically, and she brought Kyle with her everywhere as a check on her own blind spots. You're too impatient when you think you're right, Kale told her during the mediation between the Ashcroft remnants and the Grafin Wanderers, the same group she'd accidentally walked between in her first week. I am right, Serafina said. I know, but you're still too impatient about it. Kyle handed her a water skin. Being right isn't enough. People need to feel like they got there on their own. Let them. Serafina drank and thought about that and filed it. By the end of the 2nd year, she had stopped being Sarah in her own head. She was still Sarah in conversation, practical, anonymous, not inviting questions, but inside, in the part of herself that did the work, she'd reclaimed the full name. Not as a ghost, not as a wound, as a record. Serafina Voss. Luna, stripped. Border exiled. Presumed collapsed or dead. Still here. The 3rd year was when she stopped counting survival as the primary metric and started counting something else. The Alliance, she didn't call it that yet, resisted the word because naming it too early would make it brittle. But that's what it was. Had grown. Not through recruitment drives or promises or any kind of formal announcement. Through function. Through the fact that problems brought to her camp got addressed, and information shared with her came back as useful intelligence. And when she sat down to mediate between 2 groups, she invariably left both of them with something they hadn't had before. People came because it worked. They stayed because it kept working. The hard-worn skeptics like Brant, who'd seen 7 people with big ideas come and go, became the most invested. because they knew the difference between performed competence and actual competence, and they'd been watching long enough to be certain which one this was. KL, who'd been managing her own informal roster of contacts since year one, brought her something in the third autumn. "There's a former military officer 3 days east," she said. "Name of Rook. Ran logistics for a border garrison before the last round of command restructuring removed the non-noble blood officers. He's been out here 18 months, smart, bitter, and bored." "What does he want?" Serafina asked. "To be useful again, which is—" Kyle looked at her steadily. "Which is something you know about." She did. She went east and found Rook in a camp of 6 that was conspicuously well-organized compared to its resource level. He was shorter than she'd expected from Kyle's description, gray-bearded, with the compact stillness of a man who'd spent years making himself predictable to nervous people. He assessed her the way Brant had, directly, without performance. "I've heard about the camp network along the river," he said. "Word in the territories is someone's been quietly solving everyone's problems for 2 years without asking for anything." "I've been asking for things," Serafina said, "just not the things people usually ask for." "What do you ask for?" "Information, honesty, people's willingness to hear something they don't want to hear and sit with it rather than reject it immediately." Rook absorbed this. "What are you building?" She told him the truth the first time she said it out loud. Not a plan. She'd been careful not to call it a plan because plans were falsifiable and she wasn't ready to be falsified. But the shape of what was accumulating, the network of camps and the combined population and the resource-sharing infrastructure and the thing beneath all of it that she'd been most careful not to name until she was certain. An alternative, not to the Blackthorn throne specifically, to the premise that the only viable order was the one currently in power, to the idea that people cast out of institutional structure had no choice but to survive at its margins, permanently dependent on the grace of whoever held the center. Rook listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You'll need military structure eventually. Not armies, not yet, but structure. Someone who knows how to make fighters out of people who've spent years being told they're not worth the investment." "I know," she said. "I'll do that," he said. "If you'll tell me the actual name I should be calling you." A long pause. The wind moved through the eastern pines. Somewhere a creek ran over stone. She thought about the Thornwall courtyard and the sick amber sky and the sound of thousands of people holding their breath, and then she put it exactly where it belonged, behind her, visible only as geography, a coordinate that told her where she'd started and how far she'd already come. "Serafina," she said. "Serafina Voss." Rook's expression didn't change, but she watched something move through his eyes, recognition of a specific variety that told her his information network was better than she'd estimated. "I see," he said quietly. "Do we have a problem?" she asked. He considered the question with what felt like genuine weight rather than performance. "No," he said. "We have a mission." She stayed in Rook's camp for 2 days. She met the 6 people there and came away with a clear sense of each of them. She left with Rook's commitment and a new line in the mental map she'd been drawing since her 13th day in the open territory. She walked back west toward the river camps in early autumn light, the pack on her back lighter than it had been in year 1, her boots better. Marin had traded labor for decent leather at the market settlement 40 miles north and gifted her a pair 6 months ago. The trees were going rust and amber overhead, the same bruised colors as that first morning in the Thornwall courtyard, but different now in the way that everything was different when you were the one moving through it rather than the one being moved. She let herself think about Cassius Vane again. She'd been letting herself do this more regularly now that she had the stability for it, letting the thought run in full rather than cutting it before it became distracting. He'd framed her for Eastern rogue conspiracy. The bitter, specific irony of that hadn't escaped her from the beginning. He'd tried to destroy her with a fiction that was now, 3 years later, approximately true. She led a network in the Eastern Rogue territories that stretched over a region larger than 3 Blackthorn districts combined. She commanded something between 1,000 and 1,500 people across 11 major camps and 14 satellite settlements. She hadn't built an army. Rook was building that quietly, but it was early. She'd built something more durable, a functional state with no name that didn't need a name yet, because it ran on demonstrated value rather than claimed authority. She thought about Cassius Vane, and what he would do when he eventually heard the rumors. Because they were circulating, she knew that. Her information network extended into Blackthorn border trade routes, and the rumors were out there. A mysterious figure in the Eastern Territories, a leader without a name, a network no one could quite map. She thought about the specific quality of his confidence and what happened to that confidence when the thing you tried to use to destroy someone became instead the first chapter of their actual story. She thought about Darius. She stopped thinking about Darius. Then, 2 miles from camp, she heard something that stopped her cold. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses. Coming fast from the north, off the main game trail, cutting diagonal through the pine. Careless riding, the kind that meant either urgency or military confidence in this terrain, and the only people with military confidence in rogue territory were Blackthorn border units. She stepped off the trail, behind the nearest tree, and went completely still. 3 riders came through the tree line, black and silver gear, not the ceremonial plate she'd last seen them in, but field kit, travel-worn. The lead rider was scanning the terrain ahead rather than the trail. The second was tracking the ground. The third was checking east. Search pattern. Her heart rate did not increase. That surprised her briefly, and then it didn't. She'd been in the territories 3 years, and she'd been in danger before, and the panic she might have expected from her old self simply wasn't there anymore. What was there instead was clarity. Cold, specific clarity. They were not moving randomly. They were following a trace. Someone had given them a direction, and they were working it. She stayed still. The riders passed 50 feet from where she stood. The third one, checking east, slowed almost to a stop and looked along the game trail she'd just been walking. His eyes moved in a careful arc, passed over the section of tree she was behind, continued. He moved on. She waited until she couldn't hear the hoofbeats anymore. Then she waited 5 more minutes. Then she walked, faster than before, back toward camp. Back toward Kael and Rook's new presence and the 11 camps and the 1,500 people and the things she'd built that had no name yet. Because Blackthorn border riders in rogue territory on a search pattern didn't happen without orders. And orders to search for someone in eastern rogue territory meant someone had heard enough that they wanted her found, which meant the chapter she'd thought she was still beginning was already further along than she'd known, which meant the pace was about to change. She reached camp at dusk. Kael was at the perimeter and saw her expression immediately. "What happened?" Kael said. "Blackthorn riders," Seraphina said. "North approach. 3-person search formation." She kept walking toward the center of camp where the main fire was. "Get Rook. Get Brant if you can reach him by nightfall. Get everyone who's been talking about consolidation." Kael fell in beside her. "Tonight?" "Tonight." She didn't slow down. The question was never whether they'd eventually look this direction. The question was always what we'd look like when they found us. Kael was quiet for a moment, reading the thing in her voice. "And what do we look like?" she asked. Seraphina looked east toward the river camps and the 11 settlements and the 1,500 people who'd chosen to build something in the ruins of everything they'd been told they couldn't have. "Ready," she said. But when the message arrived 3 hours later, carried by a breathless runner from the northernmost camp, a boy of 17 with his hands shaking and his eyes wide, it wasn't news of riders. It was worse than riders. It was a name. "Lord Cassius Vane has been appointed special envoy to the Eastern Territories," the message read. "He arrives at the border garrison in 11 days with direct authority from the Crown to negotiate pacification agreements with rogue leadership, or classify the Eastern Network as an active insurgency." Seraphina read the message once, then read it again. Pacification agreements. Classify as insurgency. Cassius Vane, who had built the charge that destroyed her. Coming to the territories he'd invented her crime from. Carrying Crown authority to either absorb what she'd built or destroy its legitimacy entirely. She folded the message, set it on the table, looked at Kael and Rook and Brant and the 8 other people assembled in the low firelight of the camp's main shelter. "He's not coming to negotiate," she said. Flat, certain. "He's coming to take inventory of what's here so he can figure out the most efficient way to dismantle it. And if he identifies me as the leader—" "Does he know it's you?" Rook asked. "He doesn't know yet." She was thinking, the kind of fast mapping she'd trained herself to do. Resources, timelines, leverage points, What she had versus what she needed. He'll know in 11 days when he reaches the garrison and starts talking to the border traders. The rumors have too much detail. He'll put it together. So we have 11 days, Kael said. We have less than that. Serafina looked around the table. We need to meet him before he meets us, which means we need to be something he can't categorize before he has the chance to categorize it himself, which means everything we've been calling not yet is now immediately. The table was quiet. Brant, who'd come 100 miles on 48 hours' notice, who'd watched 7 people with big ideas leave and stayed for this one, looked at her with the expression she'd learned to read as close as he got to certainty. Tell us what you need, he said. She opened her mouth to answer, and outside the shelter, in the darkness at the edge of camp, a second runner arrived, running from the east this time, from a direction that shouldn't have had anyone near enough to run from. His breath ragged and his face white with something that looked like it had moved past fear into a territory fear couldn't fully describe. He didn't have a message. He had a word. Scouts, he said. Armed, moving through the eastern tree line, not blackthorn colors, not rogue. Something else. Something else. The words dropped into the shelter and stayed there while Serafina felt the map she'd been building for 3 years shift suddenly into a shape she hadn't accounted for. Not just Vane coming from the west, something else pressing from the east. And 11 days between her and the moment that decided everything. The runner's name was Fen. He was 17, hollow-cheeked, and he'd been running for 40 minutes through eastern pine forest in the dark. Serafina registered all of this in the first 3 seconds. The way his chest heaved, the specific texture of fear on his face, the direction he'd come from. And then she moved past it to the operative question. How many scouts? She said. Not asked, said. Fen pressed the back of his hand against his mouth, catching his breath. 8, maybe 10. I couldn't get close enough to count accurately. They're moving in 2 groups, parallel approach, about 300 yards apart. Armed how? Swords. No crossbows that I saw. They weren't wearing any colors I recognized. Formation? He blinked. The question was outside what he'd expected. They were moving careful, not crashing through, like they knew where they were going. Serafina looked at Rook. Rook was already on his feet, the compact stillness of him replaced by a different quality, the kind of controlled alertness that came from years of reading hostile terrain. He'd heard the same things she had and landed in the same place. Coordinated approach, no insignia, parallel flanking, he said. That's not a raiding party, that's reconnaissance in force. Someone sent them, Kael said. Someone always sends them, Serafina said. She was already moving toward the shelter entrance. Rook, I need 3 of your people on the eastern perimeter. Don't engage, I want eyes only. Count, formation, any identifying markers I can work with. Kael, get the camp on quiet alert. No fires beyond what's already lit. Brant, I'll pull the outer families back to the center line, Brant said. He was already pulling his coat on. Good. She stopped at the door. The night outside was cold and close, the pine smell sharp. She turned back to the room, to the 8 faces in the firelight. Nobody moves on them until I know what they are. We don't fight what we don't understand. Not tonight. She stepped outside. The camp's ambient sound changed the moment she was in the open. She could feel it, the subtle shift in how people were moving, faster and quieter, the specific tension of a community that had learned to respond to threat signals without being told what the threat was. 3 years of work lived in that response. She'd built it deliberately, the way you built anything that needed to function under pressure. Slowly, repeatedly, without shortcuts. She walked to the eastern perimeter herself. She didn't send someone. She went. Rook's 3 people were already positioned when she arrived. Good, she noted, he'd moved fast. She settled into a crouch beside the nearest of them, a woman named Voss, who had the particular patience of someone who'd done extended watch before. Anything? Serafina said, barely above a breath. Voss pointed with 2 fingers slightly north of east. Serafina looked. Let her eyes adjust past the immediate tree line and into the deeper dark beyond. For 30 seconds she saw nothing. Then she caught it. The specific quality of movement that wasn't wind or animal, the micro-displacement of shadow that meant bodies moving with intention. Two of them. That she could see. Moving slow and deliberate, stopping, moving again, not attacking. Mapping. She felt something settle in her chest. Not comfort, but information. Information she could use. Whatever these people were, they weren't here to hit the camp tonight. They were here to understand it first, which meant she had time. Less than she wanted. More than nothing. She stayed at the perimeter for 20 minutes, watching. Then she went back to the shelter. The assembled group looked at her when she came in. "They're not moving on us tonight," she said. "They're mapping the camp. Structure, size, approach routes. They want to know what they're dealing with before they decide what to do about it." She pulled a stool to the table and sat. Which tells us two things. First, they have orders that require accuracy before action, which means someone specific sent them and that someone needs information before they can move. Second, they've been in these territories before. The way they're moving in the Eastern Pine isn't how someone moves in unfamiliar terrain. Eastern Territories regulars, Rook said. Either a large established pack we don't have good intelligence on, or someone who's been watching us longer than we've been watching them, Kale finished. Serafina nodded. By morning, I want everything we have on organized groups operating east of the Greyfell River. Every scrap. Brant, you've been out here longest. Who've you heard about with that kind of reach? Brant's expression shifted in a way she'd learned meant he was sorting through a lot of information and deciding what was relevant. There's a name, he said. Comes up in trade talk. Nobody I've met has actual contact. They call him the Warden. He supposedly runs, a consolidated group about 60 miles east that's been absorbing smaller outfits for years. Nobody knows the real scale of it. The Warden, Serafina said. Have you heard anything that makes you doubt he's real? No, Brant said. I've heard enough that makes me think he's exactly as real as the rumors say, which should concern all of us. The shelter was quiet for a moment. Serafina thought through the geometry of it. Vane approaching from the west with Crown authority and 11 days of lead time. An unknown Eastern operator sending reconnaissance to map her camp. Her own network, real, functional, 1,500 people, sitting between the two and known to both. She'd been building in the space that Power had left vacant. The problem with building in that space was that eventually Power noticed you'd filled it. All right, she said, here's what we're doing. Tonight, perimeter watch stays doubled and nobody engages the Eastern scouts. Tomorrow morning, I'm going east. The room reacted. Kale's jaw tightened. Rook's eyes narrowed fractionally. Brant made a sound that wasn't quite a word. You go east alone and the Warden decides you're worth taking. You don't come back, Rook said. I'm not going alone. She looked at Kale. And I'm not going in blind. We're going to find out who sent those scouts before they find out who I am, which means I need to move before they finish their mapping and report back. That's tonight, Kale said. They could finish by dawn. Yes. Another silence. Kale stood up. Then we should sleep fast, she said, because we're leaving at first light. They left in the gray pre-dawn, 4 of them, Serafina, Kale, Rook, and Voss, who knew the eastern terrain better than anyone else in camp. They moved without fire, navigating by the specific quality of early light through pine canopy, and they moved fast. Serafina set the pace. It was aggressive, and nobody commented on it. The scouts' trail was findable once they were in the eastern tree line. 2 sets of boot prints in soft ground, moving south. She followed it for 3 miles before the trail veered toward a secondary creek and then dissolved in rocky ground. She stopped, read the terrain, and turned north instead. How are you reading north from a dead trail, Kyle said, behind her left shoulder. Because south of here is nothing for 20 miles except bad ground, Serafina said. And whoever sent people to map our camp is established enough to have a fixed base. Fixed bases in this territory sit near water and elevation. There's a ridge line 4 miles north that fits both. Kale was quiet for a moment. You've been doing geography on the Eastern Territory. I've been doing geography on everything within 50 miles for 18 months. You didn't tell anyone. I didn't know who was useful yet. Serafina kept moving. Now I do. The ridge line took 2 hours to reach. They approached from below and south, circling wide to avoid presenting on the obvious approach, and came up through dense underbrush onto the eastern face of the ridge, where the tree cover was heaviest. Below them, in a natural bowl formed by the ridge curve, was a camp, larger than she'd expected, significantly larger. She lay flat in the underbrush and counted what she could see: structures, cook fires from the previous night, not yet relit, movement patterns. Rook was beside her, doing the same thing in silence. After 5 minutes, he held up his hand and tapped his fingers. 80, maybe 90. That was just what was visible. A large camp, well organized. She could see the watch placement from here, not obvious, but findable if you were looking for it. And she was. "He's real," Kael breathed. "He's real," Serafina confirmed. She kept her voice below a whisper. "And he's been here long enough to build that, which means someone's coming." Voss's voice, barely audible. She gestured with one finger, below, coming up the ridge slope from the campside. One person, moving alone, which was either confidence or carelessness. Serafina watched him climb and assessed. Mid-40s, heavy build, moving with the easy efficiency of someone in excellent physical condition who'd been doing this kind of terrain for years. He stopped about 30 feet below their position and looked out over the eastern view without looking up. "You can come down," he said. His voice was low and conversational, like they were continuing a discussion. "I've known you were on the ridge for 10 minutes. You're good, but my people know this ground better." Serafina didn't move immediately. She looked at Rook. He gave a microscopic shrug. "Your call." She stood up, stepped out of the underbrush and looked down the slope at him. He looked up. His face was broad, weathered, with the kind of eyes that had spent a long time looking at things without reaction. He took her in with a single long look and then said nothing. She came down the slope. Kael, Rook, and Voss stayed where they were. She trusted Kael to make the right call if this went wrong. She stopped 5 feet from the man and looked at him directly. "The Warden," she said. "People call me that." His voice had no particular effect. "You're the one who's been building the river network." "People call it that." The edge of his mouth moved, almost nothing. "I've been watching you for 8 months," he said. "Your camp structure, the resource sharing system, the way you handled the Ashcroft and Grafen problem last year. The border trade rumors." He paused. "Cassius Vane's appointment as Eastern Envoy came through 4 days ago. I assume you know." 11 days to the garrison, she said. 10 now. He looked at her with that flat, assessing gaze. "He's going to classify your network as an insurgency if you don't come to terms. You know that." "I know what he'll try to do." "You need Eastern depth. He can't push pacification terms on a network that extends past his operational reach." The Warden was watching her face with the careful attention of someone reading a document for inconsistencies. "I've got 60 miles of Eastern territory and 340 people. You've got a river network and a reputation. Between us, Vane has nothing to stand on." "Between us," she said. "What does that mean to you?" "It means neither of us loses what we've built." He said it simply, with no particular emphasis. The simplicity was its own kind of pressure. Serafina held his gaze and thought about the geometry again. This man, the Warden, whoever he actually was, had been watching her for 8 months and hadn't approached. That meant patience. It also meant he'd been waiting for the right moment, which was this moment, which meant he'd correctly predicted that Vane's appointment would force her hand. She was being read accurately by someone she hadn't known existed a day ago. That was useful information about him, and it was uncomfortable. "You sent scouts to map my camp last night," she said. "Yes." "Before you came to me directly?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I don't make alliances with people I can't assess," he said. "I've been assessing you for 8 months from a distance. Last night was the final inventory." He paused. "You came east to find the scouts rather than fortify and wait. That told me the last thing I needed to know." Which was? "That you moved toward the problem." He said it without admiration, without anything, Just fact. I don't deal with people who wait to be hit. I deal with people who go find what's coming. She was quiet for a moment. The ridge was cold and the morning light was still thin, and below them his camp was waking up. And somewhere west of them, Cassius Vane was traveling toward a border garrison with a crown appointment and a list of things to neutralize. If we do this, she said, I need to know what you actually want out of it, not the practical case. What you want. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face adjusted very slightly, like a mechanism settling into a different configuration. The same thing you want, he said. To stop being defined by what someone else decided I was. The silence that followed was the kind that meant something had been said accurately, and both people knew it. All right, Serafina said. I need 2 days to bring my senior people up to decision. You get the same 2 days. At the end of it, we either have terms both sides can commit to, or we walk away informed. No obligations until then. 2 days, the warden said. She turned and went back up the ridge. The walk back west was faster than the walk east had been. She pushed the pace, and nobody asked her to slow down. The information she was carrying had weight, and she wanted to get it somewhere it could be used. Rook fell into step beside her after the first mile. He's bigger than we thought, Rook said. 340 is a real number. Combined with your 1,500, it's not about the numbers yet, Serafina said. It's partly about the numbers. The numbers matter when we're facing something that can only be answered with numbers. Right now we need to know whether Vane comes in with a genuine offer or with a trap, and whether the warden's actual interest aligns enough with ours to be worth the coordination cost. She moved through a low branch without ducking, long habit. An alliance that splits under pressure is worse than no alliance. So you're not convinced. I'm not unconvinced. She looked at the trail ahead. He moved patient and smart for 8 months. He read the Vane situation the same way I did. He came to the meeting alone on a ridge where I had 3 people above him. She paused. Those are all good signs. I need to know what the bad signs look like before I find them by accident. Kael, on her other side, said, He said, stop being defined by what someone else decided I was. That's the line that's going to stay with you. Already is, Serafina said. What does it mean for the timeline? She thought about Vane. 10 days now. The garrison, the Crown Authority, the classification of her network as insurgency. She thought about 1,500 people who'd built something real in territory everyone had written off, who'd been told by the architecture of the realm that they were the remainder. The what's left over after real society was finished with them. She thought about Cassius Vane coming in with his serene expression and his crown mandate to sort the remainder into compliant and threat. She thought about the Thornwall courtyard one more time. Let herself look at it directly and completely the way she rarely allowed. The sick amber sky. Darius's profile. The clean, specific fracture of the bond severing. The 9-minute walk through the castle corridors counting steps because it was the only thing in her control. She'd spent 3 years building control back, piece by piece, decision by decision, in a territory that gave her nothing but what she could extract from it through work and patience and the refusal to stop. She was not going to let Cassius Vane walk into this territory and sort her. The timeline is 8 days, she said. We need terms with the warden in 2. We need the full network senior leadership assembled in 4. We need a unified position on the Vane arrival in 6. She looked at Kael. And we need to know, before Vane reaches that garrison, that if he classifies us as insurgency, he's classifying something large enough that the classification becomes the Crown's problem, not ours. Kael absorbed this. You're not trying to avoid the confrontation. I'm trying to choose when and where it happens, Serafina said. That's the only thing that's ever mattered. They made camp at midday. A brief stop, fire and food, the practical necessities of people who'd been moving since before dawn. Serafina ate without tasting it and spent the meal going over logistics with Rook, running numbers, identifying what the combined network could realistically provide versus what it would need. Rook was precise and unsentimental about it, which was why she'd kept him close from the beginning. Medical, he said. It's the gap. Physical confrontation with a Crown envoy's guard. We're not there yet. But if this escalates, we need field medical capacity we don't currently have. I know. Marin's good with basic treatment. We need someone with actual battle medicine training. I know. She looked at him. Add it to the list of what we need the warden to provide or connect us with. See if it's something he can offer. Rook made a note in the small, folded leather journal he kept. She'd never asked what else was in that journal. She suspected it was a thorough and organized account of everything she'd ever done wrong. That was fine. She'd rather have it recorded than ignored. They reached the river camp by late afternoon. The camp was running at elevated readiness. She could see it in how people moved and where, but not panic, not disorder. Controlled readiness. She felt something she didn't often allow herself. A clean, uncomplicated satisfaction in what had been built here. She called the senior assembly for that evening, 12 people around the fire. Brant had made it back and brought 2 others from the southern camps whose judgment she relied on. She laid out everything, the warden, the numbers, the 2-day window, the Vane timeline, set without editorializing. Just what she knew and what she didn't and what the decision points were. The discussion that followed was the kind she'd worked to build toward. People who challenged each other's reasoning without challenging each other's standing, who pushed on the weak points of a plan because they needed it to be stronger rather than because they needed to be right. The hard pushback came from a man named Greaves, one of Brant's people, who'd been in rogue territory for 12 years and had the scar tissue that came with it. "We don't know this man," Greaves said. He meant the warden. 8 months watching us from a distance, and then he walks out of his camp and offers us everything we need right when we need it. That's either the best possible luck or it's a setup. "It could be both," Serafina said. "How do you separate them?" "You can't, entirely. You read everything available and you make the call with incomplete information." She looked at him directly. "Which is every decision we've made out here." Greaves held her gaze for a moment, then he sat back. Not convinced, but done pushing. The assembly concluded in 3 hours. Not with full consensus, Greaves maintained his skepticism formally, which she noted and respected, but with working agreement on the path forward. 2 days, the warden, terms that both sides could commit to or walk away from. She was the last one at the fire that night. She sat alone and let herself do the calculation she didn't do in front of others. Not logistics, the other kind. The accounting of what she was doing and what it would cost. If the warden held. If the alliance formed and held together under pressure. If Vane arrived at the garrison and found something too large and too organized to be classified away quietly. If Darius received that report and understood what it meant. She'd spent 3 years not thinking about what happened when he found out. Keeping that future off the table because it was too large and too variable to be useful to the present. She'd been right to do that. Speculation about distant consequences was a luxury the early years couldn't afford. The present was different. She was 8 days from a confrontation with the mechanism of her own exile. She was 2 days from an alliance that would make her network a genuinely significant political force. She was somewhere in the territory between being a survivor and being something the crown had to take seriously. The woman they'd exiled had become a problem they'd need to solve. She let herself feel the particular quality of that. Not triumph. Triumph was for outcomes. And outcomes were still 8 days and 1,000 contingencies away. Something different. The specific, clean thing that lived in the space between what you'd been told you were and what you'd made yourself into. She felt it fully. Let it register completely. Then she set it aside. There was work in the morning. She was halfway to her sleeping roll when Voss appeared at the shelter entrance, her face carrying the particular stillness of someone who was keeping something level by effort. "Message from the Northern Watch," Voss said. "Came in an hour ago. I waited until the assembly was done." Serafina took the folded cloth Voss held out. The Territory Network's version of a letter, written in the shorthand she'd developed with the northern camps. She read it. Her face didn't change. She read it again. 3 sentences. The message was 3 sentences. Blackthorn Border Garrison received orders this morning from the capital. Alpha King Darius Blackthorn will accompany Lord Cassius Vane to the Eastern Territories. He arrives in 9 days. The fire had burned down to coals, and the night had gone fully cold, and the pine forest made its sounds around the camp, and somewhere in the eastern ridgeline, the warden's 340 people were sleeping or keeping watch, and in 9 days, Darius Blackthorn was going to step into her territory. Not his envoy. Not his order. Him. She stood in the dark with that information and felt it settle into all the places she'd kept empty so she could work. He was coming here, to her territory, the territory he'd cast her into, the territory he'd put in her charge in the most accidental and brutal way possible, and she'd built something in it that was now too large to ignore, and he was coming to see it himself. She didn't know yet whether he was coming as a king who'd heard the rumors and needed to assess the threat. She didn't know whether Vane had brought him or whether he'd insisted. She didn't know what he knew about who was leading the river network. She knew one thing. 9 days was not enough time to be ready. It was also all the time she had. And for the first time since the Thornwall courtyard, since the sick amber morning and the obsidian crown and the herald's trained voice carrying her sentence across thousands of witnesses, Serafina Voss understood that what came next was not something she was preparing to survive. It was something she was preparing to win. The 9 days collapsed into 7. The revised message came through the Northern Watch at dawn, 2 days after the first one, and Serafina read it standing in the camp's open center, with her coat still unbuttoned and her hair undone, and the cold morning hitting her face like a flat hand. Darius's advance party had moved faster than projected. The border garrison would receive them in 7 days, not 9. 2 days stripped from a timeline that had already been tight enough to cut herself on. She finished reading, folded the cloth, put it in her coat pocket. 7 days, she said to Kael, who was standing 3 feet away watching her face. I heard. Kael's voice was level. The warden meeting is tomorrow. I know. Do you want to move it to today? Serafina thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. No. We go tomorrow as agreed. Changing the timeline on him now signals panic, and I don't negotiate from panic. She buttoned her coat. But I want Rook's full situation assessment by tonight. Everything we have, everything we're missing, everything the warden can realistically provide. I need numbers I can actually use in that room. She spent the day moving, camp to camp, 3 of the river settlements in 6 hours, not inspecting. She knew these camps, knew their people, knew their operational state, but being visible, being present. The network's coherence lived in the space between logistics and human trust, and human trust required a body in the room occasionally, not just messages carried by runners. She shook hands and ate quick meals and listened to 2 separate disputes about resource allocation that she mediated without sitting down. She left each camp with the specific sense of a thing running correctly under pressure, a calibrated machine that had been built slowly enough to actually hold. She thought about the warden while she walked between camps. She'd gone over the Ridge meeting a dozen times in the 2 days since. The patience of it, 8 months watching before approaching. The timing, coming to her precisely when Vane's appointment created a narrow window. The detail that stayed with her most. He'd known she would go east to find the scouts rather than wait. He'd read her accurately from a distance. That kind of reading was useful and dangerous in proportions she hadn't fully mapped yet. Rook's assessment was waiting when she returned to the main camp at dusk. He'd laid it out on the rough camp table in the shelter. Population figures, supply lines, defensive capacity, identified gaps. She stood over it and read it completely twice without speaking. The gap is 9 days wide, Rook said. Even with the warden's people folded in, we need 9 days minimum to establish the kind of coordination that holds under real pressure. We have 7. 6 now, she said. By the time we have terms tomorrow and get them back to full leadership for ratification, 6. He said it flatly, the way he said things he didn't like but wasn't going to obscure. Which means if Darius and Vane arrive at that garrison and push immediately, we're presenting a coalition that looks unified but has seams. Every coalition has seams. Seams that show under pressure break things. I know. She looked at the figures. What's the warden's medical capacity? Unknown. It's on the list for tomorrow. Make it the first thing on the list. She straightened. If he's got someone with actual battle medicine experience, that goes a long way toward the gap. Not all of it, but a direction. She slept badly. Not from anxiety. She'd trained herself past the kind of anxiety that made itself useless in the body, but from the specific wakeful quality of a mind that kept finding new configurations in the same information and running each one to its conclusion. At some point before dawn, she stopped trying to sleep and sat at the shelter entrance, watching the dark and letting the configurations run. The one that kept coming back was the simplest one. Darius was coming personally, not sending Vayne alone, not sending a military escort to enforce a political process, coming himself, which meant either he was genuinely alarmed by what the rumors described, or there was something else he needed to assess that he didn't trust anyone else to assess for him. She sat with that and didn't name what she thought it meant. Not yet. The warden meeting happened on the ridge again, neutral ground, 8 people total. Serafina brought Kale, Rook, and Brant. The warden brought 3 people whose roles she read in the first 10 minutes. A logistics operator, a territorial scout, and a woman who sat at the warden's left shoulder and said almost nothing, and whose silence had the quality of someone who was recording everything. The warden himself was as she'd found him, flat, patient, specific. No performance. She appreciated the absence of performance more than she could have articulated. They worked for 3 hours. Real work, actual numbers, actual resource lines, actual decision points about who held authority over what and under what circumstances. She pushed on every ambiguity and he pushed back on 2 of hers, both of which were legitimate pushes that she conceded and adjusted. The woman at his left shoulder made notes. By the end of the 3rd hour, they had the shape of something she could bring back to full leadership with a genuine recommendation. "One condition I didn't put on the table," the warden said, as the meeting was resolving. She waited. "If this goes the direction it might go," he said, "and the crown pushes beyond what a political confrontation can hold, I need to know who's making the calls on your side, not the council, the person." He looked at her directly. "I've been operating under the assumption that it's you. I need that confirmed, not implied." The shelter was quiet. His 3 people were looking at the table. Her 3 people were looking at her. "It's me," she said. "Then the full name," he said. "Not just Sarah." A long pause. She'd known, at some level, this was coming. You couldn't build what she'd built and keep the name buried indefinitely. The name was the last piece of cover, and it was functionally exhausted. The warden had read her accurately enough that giving him a false confirmation was more dangerous than the truth. "Serafina Voss," she said. The warden's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A shift, like a lock finding its tumbler. "I know that name," he said quietly. "Most people do." "The Exiled Luna." He said it without effect. Information, not judgment. "The former Exiled Luna," she said. "Currently something else." He held her gaze for a moment. "The Alpha King's coming to this territory to find someone specific." "Possibly. We're building a coalition that puts you at its center, which means when Darius Blackthorn walks into this territory, he's walking into a situation where the woman he exiled is the one he has to negotiate with." "Yes." The warden was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she could hear the wind moving over the ridgetop and the distant sound of something in the tree line far below. "All right," he said finally, "let's finish the terms." They finished the terms. She brought the agreement back to full leadership the following morning and presented it without editorializing. The senior assembly ratified it in 4 hours, Greaves maintaining formal skepticism and signing anyway because the alternative was worse. She sent runners to every camp in the network with the consolidated position before nightfall. 5 days to the garrison. It was on the 4th day that everything broke. She was in the middle of a logistics review with Rook when Kael came into the shelter. The way Kael moved told her immediately. Not urgency exactly, something below urgency, something that had moved past the first shock of whatever the information was, and into the specific stillness of a person carrying something heavy and choosing their footing. "Close the review," Kael said. Rook looked at Serafina. She looked at Kael. "Rook stays," Serafina said. Kael sat down. She put both hands flat on the table, a gesture Serafina had learned to read as Kael anchoring herself, needing something solid to press against. "Fen came back from the northern route an hour ago," Kael said. "He was doing the supply check run to the Harrow camp. When he arrived, the camp was empty." Serafina waited. Not abandoned. Empty the way a camp looks when it's been left in a hurry but deliberately. Bedrolls gone, food stores gone, the watch positions cleaned out. Kael's voice was completely even. That evenness was itself information. Someone warned them. They packed and moved before Fen got there. Warned them of what? Rook said. Kale looked at Serafina. Fen found one thing left behind, a message cloth, addressed to you. She put it on the table. Serafina picked it up, read it. The message was short. The shorthand was the network's own, the code she'd developed herself, that she'd shared with senior camp leaders and the people she trusted most. Whoever had written this knew the code. The Alpha King's advance party has been given your name, your location, and the network structure. They have it from inside the coalition. Harrow Camp won't be the last to run. Get out before the garrison receives the full brief. She read it twice, set it down. She felt the floor shift, not physically. The shelter was solid, the ground was solid, but some interior architecture relocated without her permission, the way a building sounds different after something load-bearing is removed. Inside the coalition, Rook said. His voice had gone to the flat register that meant he was working hard to keep it there. Inside the coalition, Serafina confirmed. The three of them sat with that. She ran through it. Not emotionally, that would come later when she could afford it, but operationally. The network structure that had been shared with Darius's advance party, what did it contain? She knew exactly what it contained because she'd built it. Names, camp locations, approximate population, resource lines, the warden's integration and what that added to the combined reach. The timeline, everything someone would need to classify the network accurately and present a pacification strategy that actually addressed what it was dealing with, rather than what they'd assumed from the outside. How long has the advance party been in the territory? She said. Unknown, Kyle said. Fen didn't see them. He saw what they left, which means they may already have the brief. They may have had it for days. She looked at the message cloth again. The Harrow camp got warned by whoever sent this, which means whoever sent this is inside the coalition and knew the advance party was moving on specific locations. Someone warned one camp and not others, Rook said. Someone warned the camp they have most connection to, Serafina said, or the camp they thought was most at risk first. She pushed back from the table. I need to know who sent that message. The shorthand narrows it. How many people in the coalition have the full code? 12, Kyle said immediately. The senior assembly plus the 2 runners you certified last month. 14 people. 14. Serafina stood and walked to the shelter entrance and stood looking at the camp. The regular afternoon activity of 1,500 people who'd built something real in territory everyone had written off. Children doing their lessons in the East Quarter, the smell of the afternoon cook fires, Voss running a patrol rotation change on the north perimeter, her voice carrying faint and sharp across the open ground. She thought about what it meant that someone inside had given her network structure to Darius's advance party. Not just the practical consequence, the operational damage, which was real and significant. The other thing, the thing that lived beneath the operational damage and was going to have to be looked at directly whether she wanted to or not. 14 people, 12 from the senior assembly. People she'd worked alongside, argued with, shared difficult meals with in difficult camps for years. People who'd signed the warden agreement 3 days ago and shaken hands on it. One of them had gone the other direction. She turned back inside. Get the senior assembly, she said. Everyone. Now. If one of them sent that message, Kyle started. I know. Get them anyway. The assembly convened in 40 minutes. 11 of the 12 senior members were reachable in that time. Greaves was the 12th, and he arrived last, slightly out of breath from the distance. Serafina waited until they were all seated. Then she put the message cloth in the center of the table. Someone in this room, she said, gave the Alpha King's advance party our full network structure, name, locations, and the warden integration. The silence that followed had a specific texture. She watched it move across each face. Shock, calculation, anger, something that might have been guilt, or might have been the face people made when they were watching for the guilty reaction in others. How do you know it's someone here? Said a man named Davan from the southern camps. His voice was careful. The shorthand on the warning message, Serafina said. Full code. 14 people have it. She watched the room process that. Greaves said, the warning message. Someone inside sent a warning to the Harrow camp. which means whoever gave the structure to the advance party either regretted it afterward and tried to partially undo the damage, or there are two separate inside sources and one of them is trying to burn the other. The room went very quiet. Either way, Serafina said, we have a structural breach and I need to know the extent of it before Darius reaches the garrison, which is now 1 day away. 1 day, Devon said. His voice had changed. You said 5 days yesterday. The timeline accelerated. I received that information this morning. She looked around the table. 14 faces. I need everyone in this room to account for their communications over the past 6 days. Runners sent, messages received, contact with anyone outside the established network channels. I need it now, and I need it complete. The accounting took 2 hours and told her very little that was definitive. People's memories of their own communications were selectively reliable under pressure, and she knew that. She wasn't looking for a confession. She was looking for a gap. The person whose accounting had a hole in it, an absence that didn't fit the shape of what she knew about their movements. She found it, not in a dramatic way. In the way these things actually happened, a small inconsistency between what one person said and what someone else remembered about the same 2-day period. Devon. She didn't name it in the assembly room. She adjourned the meeting and asked Devon to stay behind, which she did casually enough that it didn't read as an accusation, just procedural. The others filed out. Kael stayed. When it was 3 of them, Serafina sat across the table from Devon and looked at him. He was a compact man, late 40s, from the southernmost camps. He'd been in the territory for 8 years. He'd been in the senior assembly for 6 months, one of the more recent additions, brought in when the southern camps joined the network in earnest. She'd trusted his judgment on resource allocation. She'd eaten at his fire twice. Davin, she said. His name, just his name, the particular quality of someone naming something they already know. He looked at his hands. They came to me 3 weeks ago, he said. His voice was very quiet. Not Darius, not Vayne. 2 men dressed as traitors. They knew things they shouldn't have known about my family in the Southern Territory, inside the Blackthorn border. He paused. My daughter. Serafina was completely still. They said if the network was classified as insurgency, everyone with family connections inside the border would be held accountable. Their families. His jaw was tight. They said they only needed structural information, that it wouldn't be used to hurt anyone here, that it would just help the Crown understand what this actually was so they could approach it correctly. And you believed that, Kael said. Her voice was flat. I believed my daughter would be safe, Devon said. He looked up. His eyes were dry and his face had the specific quality of a man who'd made a decision he knew was wrong and had been carrying it for 3 weeks. I didn't think they'd move this fast. I thought there would be more time, that the Vayne meeting would happen first and it would be political and the Hera warning, Serafina said. A long pause. I sent it. His voice cracked on the last word, a small fracture quickly controlled. When I understood what the advance party was actually doing, when I understood that the political process I was told would happen was not what they intended. He looked at her directly for the first time since the room had emptied. I know that doesn't repair what I did. No, she said. It doesn't. She sat with what she felt for exactly long enough to identify it accurately. Not rage. Rage was for situations where she had the luxury of it, something colder. The specific grief of a person who'd learned again that the architecture of betrayal was almost always built from comprehensible materials. Devon hadn't sold her network for power or profit. He'd sold it because his daughter existed and someone had known to reach her through that. That was the particular cruelty of it, that it made sense, that she could follow the logic from the inside of it and find nothing irrational, only a man who'd been handed an impossible choice and made the wrong one. Cassius Vayne's fingerprints were all over this. Not his name, she couldn't prove that yet, but the texture of it, the specific choice to approach through family rather than through direct pressure or bribery, the patience of it. 3 weeks of waiting after the initial approach, letting Devon carry the weight of what he'd done while the network unknowingly continued building around him. It was the same patience and the same precision that had framed her 3 years ago. Where is your daughter now? she said. Davin blinked. Whatever he'd been expecting, it wasn't that. Southern Territory, he said, inside the border. Can she be reached? A long pause. I have a contact, a trader who moves the border regularly. Get her out, Serafina said. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, get her into the open territory. Tonight, if possible. Davin stared at her. I'm not done with you, she said. What you did has real consequences for this network, and we will address them. But your daughter is a child who has nothing to do with any of this, and I'm not going to let her be used as leverage against you or against me while I still have the ability to remove her from the equation. She held his gaze. Do you understand? He nodded. Something had broken open in his face that was too raw to look at directly. Get her out, she said again. Then come back to me. Kael walked Devon out and came back to the shelter alone. She sat across from Serafina and they were quiet for a moment. The advance party has the full structure, Kael said. They'll have transmitted it to the garrison by now. Darius walks in tomorrow knowing exactly what he's walking into. Yes. And the Warden integration. Yes? Which means the confrontation Vane wanted, classifying us as insurgency with a full military response, is now possible in a way it wasn't before. He has the map. Kael's voice was very careful. Serafina. If Darius receives a complete military brief on this network before the political meeting happens, he can choose to move militarily rather than diplomatically. She'd been running it since Davin's first word. The calculation was as clean and cold as standing water. Which means the meeting I've been planning for, the confrontation where I present the evidence about Vane and make Darius understand what was done to both of us, that meeting doesn't happen if he comes in as a military commander rather than a political negotiator. Kael said nothing. The timeline is gone, Serafina said. Everything we've built for the past week, the Warden agreement, the ratification, the unified position, it assumes we have time to present it. If Darius receives the military brief tonight and moves at dawn, what do we do? Kael said. Serafina stood. She walked to the entrance again and looked out at the camp. The fires, the families, the 1,500 people who'd trusted her to make the calls that kept this thing alive. There was one move left. One move that didn't require the timeline she no longer had, that turned the breach from a wound into a pivot. It wasn't the move she'd been building toward. It was the move the situation had stripped her down to. She was going to have to go to Darius first. Not to the meeting, not to the garrison where Vane would be present and the political architecture would favor his framing. She was going to have to reach Darius before he received the full military brief. Tonight. With the evidence she'd been carrying for 3 years, the documentation of the frame, the names, the financial records she'd collected piece by piece through the border trade networks, the testimony she'd gathered from 3 people with direct knowledge of what Vane had constructed. She was going to walk into the Alpha King's advance camp in the dark, alone, and put everything she had on the table before Cassius Vane had the chance to present the version of this story that ended with 1,500 people classified as enemy combatants. She felt the scale of it, let herself feel it completely. This was not the confrontation she'd prepared for. This was the confrontation that preparation was now useless against. The only thing that worked here was the thing she'd had since the beginning, the truth of what had been done, and the will to put it in front of the person who needed to see it, regardless of what that cost her. She turned to Kael. I need the full evidence package, she said. Everything, the documentation, the testimony records, the financial chain, everything I've been holding. Kael went very still. Sarah, I know. If this goes wrong I know. If he receives the military brief before you reach him, or if Vane has advanced people in the camp, or if Darius decides the easiest outcome is detaining you and using you as leverage, Kael, she said it steady, I know every version of how this goes wrong. I've run all of them. But if I don't go tonight, the military brief arrives at dawn, and everything we've built is framed as enemy territory before I get to speak a single word. She held Kael's gaze. The only thing that changes the frame is me. Tonight. Before anyone else gets to define what I am. A long silence. Kael stood, went to the locked chest at the shelter's back wall, opened it with the key she wore on her wrist. She brought the package to the table, 3 years of careful collection wrapped in oilskin cloth, tied with a plain cord. Serafina picked it up, felt its weight. She thought about the Thornwall courtyard one last time. The sick amber sky. The herald's trained voice. The 9 minutes of counting steps because it was the only thing in her control. 3 years ago, she had walked out of that courtyard with nothing. Tonight, she was walking into the dark carrying everything. The woman who'd been cast out as a traitor was going to stand in front of the man who'd cast her and show him what his trust had actually been doing while it was pointed the wrong direction. Whatever happened after that was a different story. This was the end of the one about surviving. She moved at midnight. No torch, no escort. The oilskin package inside her coat pressed flat against her ribs, where she could feel its edges with every breath. The pine forest at midnight had a specific quality of dark, not absolute, the stars doing their faint work through the canopy breaks, and she moved through it the way she'd learned to move in the territory's first brutal months, using the sound of water to orient, avoiding the obvious game trails, reading the ground by pressure through her boot soles rather than by sight. She told Kyle where she was going and what to do if she didn't come back. That conversation had been short, and she wasn't going to replay it. The advance camp was 4 miles northwest, positioned near the Garrison Road. She knew this because her Northern Watch had tracked its arrival 2 days ago and logged its location without being told to, because that was the kind of network she'd built. She covered the 4 miles in just under an hour, moving faster than was strictly safe in the dark, and arrived at the camp's outer perimeter with her heart rate elevated and her coat wet at the collar from exertion she hadn't slowed down for. She stopped 30 yards out and assessed. 12 men that she could see. Royal Guard, not in ceremonial plate now. Field kit, functional. 4 on visible watch rotation, the others sleeping or in the 2 large canvas shelters at the camp's center. A fire burning low at the perimeter, another at the center. Good sight lines north and east. The west approach, where she was standing, had a dead angle behind a stand of dense pine that the watch rotation left uncovered for approximately 40 seconds every 3 minutes. She waited for the gap, took it, moved to the camp's edge and stopped in the shadow of the easternmost shelter. Breathed. Then she walked out into the firelight and stood in the open. The nearest guard saw her in under 2 seconds and had a crossbow raised in under 4. She kept her hands visible and her body completely still. "My name is Serafina Voss," she said. "I need to speak with Alpha King Darius Blackthorn, tonight." The guard didn't lower the crossbow. He was young, she registered, 22 at most, good instincts, the weapon level and steady. He wasn't going to make a mistake in either direction without orders. "Don't move," he said. "I'm not moving," she said. 3 more guards materialized from the darkness in the next 30 seconds. By the time the shelter flap opened and a senior officer stepped out, there were 6 crossbows pointed at her chest, and she was standing in the camp's center firelight with her hands open at her sides and her face showing nothing. The officer was a man she didn't recognize, broad-shouldered, graying at the temples, the look of someone who'd been managing difficult situations for long enough that this one barely registered as elevated. He looked at her for a long moment. "Say the name again," he said. "Serafina Voss, former Luna of the Blackthorn Realm. I have evidence of high treason committed against the crown, and I need to present it to Darius Blackthorn before the garrison receives its morning brief." The officer's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. He turned and went back into the shelter. She stood in the crossbow light and waited and breathed slow and controlled and thought about nothing except keeping her hands exactly where they were. The shelter flap opened again 7 minutes later. Darius walked out. She'd prepared for this. She'd been preparing for it for 3 years in the way you prepared for something that lived at the intersection of personal and strategic, by building the wall between those two things as solid as she could make it, so that when the moment came she would be functional rather than wrecked. She thought she was ready. She was mostly ready. He looked older. Not dramatically. He was 34. She knew his age. She'd known every fact about him so thoroughly that in the early exile months she'd had to actively work to stop cataloging them. He looked like a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a while and had gotten competent at carrying it. The obsidian crown was absent, field travel, pragmatic. But he wore the signet ring and the black field coat of royal command, and he stood the same way he'd always stood, like the weight of the room was something he'd chosen rather than something that had landed on him. He looked at her. She looked at him. 3 years of territory between them and whatever had existed before it, and the firelight hitting his face from the left the way it had on winter evenings in the War Council room when the sessions ran late and the candles burned low, and she used to be able to read the difference between the thoughts he was keeping and the thoughts he was ready to say. She couldn't read it now. Too much distance, too much change on both sides. "You have 60 seconds to tell me why I shouldn't have you detained," he said. His voice was what she remembered, controlled, direct, with that specific quality of someone who'd trained himself not to let the surface show the current. "Your advance party has a full structural brief on my network," she said. "Names, locations, population, resource lines, the Eastern Alliance. All of it. Cassius Vane's people acquired it through a coercion operation targeting a camp member's family." She kept her voice at the same register his was. Controlled, factual. "If that brief reaches your military command at the garrison tomorrow morning, you'll be presented with a pacification recommendation that classifies 1,500 people as enemy combatants. Once you authorize that recommendation, you cannot unauthorize it without a political cost that Vane will use against you." She paused. "That's what he's been building toward. Not a frontier security operation, a position where you're committed to a military response before you hear any other version of this situation." The silence extended. The guards hadn't lowered their crossbows. "You have evidence," Darius said. 3 years of it." She put her right hand slowly inside her coat. She watched 3 guards track the movement. Nobody fired. Good. And withdrew the oilskin package. She held it out. "Documentation of the frame that was used to exile me. Financial records connecting Vane's house to the rogue elements he accused me of conspiring with. Testimony from 3 people with direct knowledge, including one person currently serving on your noble council who has been managed by Vane since before I was Luna." Darius looked at the package, didn't take it. "You've been in the Eastern Territories for 3 years," he said, "building a network of 1,500 people, and you're asking me to believe that was not an insurgency. I'm asking you to look at what I built and tell me what an insurgency looks like by comparison." She kept the package extended. "An insurgency destabilizes. What I built runs water systems and medical care and dispute mediation for people your court decided were disposable. If that's what an insurgency looks like, you have a definitional problem, not a frontier problem." Something moved across his face. She caught it and couldn't name it quickly enough. He took the package. She breathed. He looked at it in his hand for a moment, then he looked back at her. "You came here alone," he said. "Yes." "In the dark. To an advanced military camp. I was running out of options that didn't involve you receiving someone else's version of this before I could present my own." A long pause. "Come inside," he said. The shelter was larger than it looked from outside. A proper command tent, a table with maps, 2 oil lamps. A second man was inside, seated at the table, and she recognized him. Captain Edrin, Darius's personal command officer, who she'd attended briefings with for 2 years, and who was now looking at her with an expression that moved through several phases before landing on something unreadable. Darius set the package on the table. He didn't open it immediately. He looked at her across the lamplight. "How many people in the Eastern Network actually know who you are?" he said. "The senior leadership, approximately 14. The wider network knows the leader as Sarah." She paused. "The Eastern Alliance partner knows the full name. He's had it for 3 days. The warden." She didn't react to how readily he had that. "Yes." "His name is Aldrich Morn," Darius said. "Hector Morn's son. He was expelled from noble standing 6 years ago over a land dispute that Cassius Vane engineered." He said it flatly, watching her face. "When I received the structural brief last night," she said. Something tightened in her chest. "Last night," he confirmed. "I spent 4 hours going over it. The names, the locations, the scope of what's been built." He paused. "And I recognized Aldrich Morn's name from Hector's files, which led me to a question I've been sitting with since midnight." She waited. If Vane engineered the expulsion of a noble heir, and then that same man ends up building a significant independent operation in the Eastern Territories directly adjacent to the network built by the woman Vane framed and exiled, Darius stopped, set his hands flat on the table. That's not coincidence. No, she said. It's a pattern. He's been clearing the board, Darius said, for years. Everyone who could challenge his position or had evidence of what he was doing, he found a mechanism to remove them. Me included. He said the last two words with a quality she'd never heard from him before. Not anger, not guilt. Something rawer than both. He used me. My court, my authority, my name. He used all of it. The lamplight moved. Something in the tent shifted. She picked up the oilskin package, untied the cord, and laid the first document on the table between them. Then look, she said, and I'll show you exactly how. They worked for 2 hours, Darius and Edrin both. She walked them through the documentation in the order she'd assembled it. The financial chain first, the testimony records second, the specific connections between Vane's house resources and the rogue elements who'd been used to construct the frame last. She knew this material the way you knew something you'd built yourself from raw pieces over years. Every seam, every gap, every place where the evidence was solid, and every place where it required inference she could support but not prove absolutely. Darius asked questions. Precise, methodical. The questions of someone who knew how evidence worked and was checking it rather than accepting it. She answered each one directly, including the ones where the answer was that she couldn't prove it conclusively. Edrin said almost nothing. He made notes. When they reached the last document, the testimony of the noble council member, Darius went very still. He read it twice. Lord Aldrin Thatch, he said. He approached me through a border trader 8 months ago, Seraphina said. He'd been looking for a way out of Vane's management for 2 years. He has direct knowledge of 3 separate operations. The frame against me, the expulsion of Aldrich Morn, and a third operation against your Eastern Garrison commander 18 months ago that you were told was a resignation. Darius looked up. Garrison Commander Fell resigned due to... He didn't resign. Vane had his family threatened. He left because he had no other choice. She held his gaze. The same mechanism he used on my camp member 4 days ago. He finds the person, and then he finds the person they can't afford to lose. The silence in the tent was absolute. Darius stood. He walked to the tent's far end and stood with his back to her for a moment. She watched his shoulders. She could read the set of them even across 3 years and the specific gulf of what had happened between them. She could see the thing he was working through, the scale of the recalculation happening in real time. He turned back. The pacification brief reaches the garrison at dawn, he said. Vane's people sent it ahead. It carries my authorization stamp. He prepared the documents before I'd reviewed anything, and He stopped. I signed the authorization before I saw your brief, before I understood what the brief was actually presenting. She felt the ground shift. Vane has a signed authorization for military action against my network, she said. Yes. The word came out flat and hard and wrong. And he's at the garrison. He arrived yesterday. She ran the calculation in under 3 seconds. Vane at the garrison, assigned military authorization. Dawn approaching, the garrison commander, whoever had replaced Fell, receiving both simultaneously and being given the framework that made military response the only logical reading. He doesn't need you anymore, she said. He has your signature. He can execute the pacification and present it as Crown-authorized response to a verified insurgency, and by the time you countermand it, 1,500 people are... She stopped. Darius was already moving. Edrin. Full wake. Now. The camp detonated into controlled motion. She stood in the center of it and watched 12 royal guards go from sleep to field ready in under 4 minutes. Watched Edrin issuing orders with the clipped precision of someone who'd drilled for exactly this kind of acceleration. Watched Darius standing in the center of it, with his coat fully buttoned and his face showing the specific expression she recognized now. Not the performed certainty of the king in the Thornwall courtyard, but something harder and less comfortable. The look of a man who'd finally understood the thing he'd been inside of and was going to have to move fast to address its consequences. He looked at her once, across the organized chaos of the camp coming to readiness. Can you reach your network faster than we can reach the garrison? He said. Yes. How long to mobilize? I have runners positioned, 2 hours to full alert. We need the garrison isolated from Vane's communication before dawn. He cannot send a secondary authorization to the military units already stationed at the eastern perimeter. He held her gaze. Can your people do that? She thought about Kael and the northern camps and the watch rotations and the runners who'd been on elevated readiness for 6 days. Yes, she said. Something passed between them, not reconciliation. That was a different conversation requiring a different amount of time and a different absence of immediate catastrophe. Something operational. Two people who knew each other's capabilities reading the situation the same way and reaching the same conclusion about what the next 6 hours required. Then go, he said. She went. The 4 miles back was faster than the 4 miles there because she was running. The cold hit her face and the pack hit her back, and the pine forest moved past her in the dark, and she ran with the specific kind of controlled urgency that didn't spend anything. It didn't have to spend. The pace she'd learned in the first brutal months when conserving herself was the only resource management that mattered. She reached camp at the edge of dawn, and Kael was already at the perimeter. She'd been there, Serafina understood, since midnight, because Kael was that kind of person. Tell me, Kael said. Vane has assigned authorization for military action, and he's at the garrison. We have until dawn to isolate his communication lines. She was already moving into camp, already seeing the shapes of what needed to happen in what order. Wake Rook. Get the northern runners out in the next 15 minutes. I need the warden informed in the next 20. Rook knows the route. What did Darius say? Kael said. She stopped for half a second. He's moving on the garrison, she said, with what he has, which isn't enough to stop Vane alone. Then we move with him. Yes. The camp came up fast. She'd built this, the response capacity, the watch rotation, the runner network, and it worked the way she'd designed it to work, which was another way of saying the 3 years of patient construction were about to pay a dividend she'd never specifically planned for but had always, somewhere underneath the planning, known might be required. Rook had his people out in 12 minutes. The northern runners left at 13. She sent the warden message herself, directly, because this wasn't the kind of communication she wanted filtered through another set of hands. She was on the eastern perimeter when the first light came over the ridge, that early gray that wasn't dawn yet, just the sky remembering the direction of the sun. She stood and looked at it and breathed. Behind her, the camp was running. In front of her, the eastern territory spread out in the gray pre-dawn, the pine forest and the creek lines and the ridge where she'd met Aldrich Morn 3 days ago, and the road to the garrison beyond it, where Cassius Vane was standing with a signed military authorization and a plan that had been running for years and was now, for the first time, fully visible. She thought about the Thornwall courtyard one final time. Let herself look at it completely, and then let it go. Not because it didn't matter, but because what it had been was material for what she'd become, and she'd used it, and now she needed both hands free for what was in front of her. Kael appeared at her shoulder. The warden's people are moving, Kael said. Runner confirmed 15 minutes ago. He's bringing everything. Good. Darius's advance party? Moving to the garrison. She paused. He needs us to isolate Vane's communications before his column arrives. If Vane sends the secondary authorization before the advance party gets there, then the eastern perimeter units move on our camps before anyone can stop them, Kael finished. Yes. They stood side by side in the gray early light, looking at the road. This is the moment, Kael said quietly, the one everything's been pointed at. Serafina looked at the road to the garrison and the ridge and the approaching light and felt it. The weight of 1,500 people and 3 years of construction and the specific terrible clarity of a situation that had no more room for preparation, only execution. She thought about what it meant to be the most dangerous thing in a room. She'd understood it wrong for most of her life. She'd thought it meant strength, capability, force. She understood it differently now, from the inside of having been cast out and having built in the gap. The most dangerous thing in a room wasn't the strongest person. It was the one who had already lost everything once and survived it and was still standing here choosing to fight for what they'd rebuilt anyway. Cassius Vane was about to find out what that looked like aimed at him. "Let's go," she said. They were 200 yards down the garrison road when the horn sounded from the east. Not her network's signal. A different sound, lower and longer. The kind of horn that carried military intent rather than communication. She stopped. Kael stopped. The horn sounded again. "That's not the garrison," Kael said. Her voice had gone to the flat register of suppressed alarm. "No," Seraphina said. The sound came from the southeast, the direction of the border perimeter units, the standing military forces that had been stationed at the eastern edge of Blackthorn territory for 18 months and had been waiting, she understood in the next 3 seconds with complete cold clarity, for exactly this authorization. Vane hadn't waited for dawn. He'd sent the secondary authorization at midnight, before she'd even reached Darius's camp, before any of the conversations that had happened in the command tent had happened. He'd prepared for the possibility that Darius might be reached before the garrison brief arrived, and he'd moved his timeline forward. He'd been 4 steps ahead, and she'd been running at 3. The horn sounded a third time, closer now. She looked at Kael. Kael looked at her. Behind them, the camp was reacting. She could hear it, the sound of 1,500 people registering something wrong. And somewhere to the east, Aldrich Morn was moving with 340 people who hadn't been told the timeline had just collapsed. And somewhere northwest, Darius was moving with 12 royal guards toward a garrison where Cassius Vane had already won the first move. She looked at the road. The garrison to the northwest and the border units to the southeast, and her network between them and the gray light coming up over the ridge. The only thing left was the thing she'd built herself to be. She turned back toward camp. "Get everyone up," she said. "Right now, every person who can move." Sarah. Vane moved early. "We don't have the garrison road." She was already moving, already running the numbers in her head, already seeing the shape of what the next hour required. "Which means we make him come through us to get to Darius. And we make sure Darius is watching when he does it." Kael ran. The camp was fully awake in under 3 minutes. She stood at its center and looked at the faces turning toward her. 1,500 people who'd trusted her calls for 3 years, who'd followed her through the hard decisions and the ambiguous ones, and the ones that had been nothing but survival calculus in a hostile territory. She felt the weight of that trust, the way she felt the cold and the early light, and the horn still sounding somewhere in the eastern dark. She opened her mouth to speak, and behind her, from the northwest road, came a sound she hadn't anticipated. Hoofbeats, fast, a single rider, and then the rider was in the camp's outer edge and off the horse and running toward her, and it was one of Rook's people, a young woman named Set, with her face white and her breath coming in ragged pulls. "The garrison," Set said. "Commander." "The garrison commander. He refused to execute the authorization." Seraphina stared at her. "He read the authorization, and he refused it," Set said. "He's holding Vane in the command building. He's asking for Alpha King Blackthorn to arrive and settle it directly." She stopped, caught her breath. "But Vane's personal guard is at the garrison. 24 men, and they're not under garrison command." 24 men. Vane's personal guard. Not subject to the garrison commander's refusal. Able to move independently on a noble lord's authorization. She understood what was about to happen in the garrison building with 3 seconds of clean cold calculation. She looked at Kael. "The eastern perimeter horn," Kael said. "That's Vane's guard signaling the perimeter units." "He doesn't need the garrison to execute this," Seraphina said. "He's going to move the perimeter units himself through his personal guard authority and present Darius with a fait accompli." She looked at the road northwest. Darius is walking into a situation where Vane's people are already in motion and the garrison is locked down. She looked back at the camp. "How far is Darius from the garrison?" she said to Set. 20 minutes. Maybe less." 20 minutes. 20 minutes between Darius arriving at a garrison where Vane's personal guard was already coordinating with eastern perimeter units, between an Alpha King walking into a trap laid by the man he'd trusted for years, with his court and his crown and his most consequential decisions. Between everything breaking beyond the point where evidence and testimony and 3 years of careful documentation meant anything at all. She had one move. The same move she'd had last night, and the night before, and every night in the territory for 3 years. Move toward the problem. Don't wait for it to define the terms. Rook, she said. He was there. He was always there when she needed him. She'd noted this about him 100 times and still found it remarkable. Take 20 people, fastest we have, cut northwest through the pine. Stay off the garrison road. I need you at the garrison's eastern perimeter before Vane's guard reaches it. 20 people against 24 of Vane's guard, Rook said. Plus whatever the garrison commander has inside that hasn't been moved yet, she said. And you're not fighting them. You're being visible. You're making it clear that anything Vane's guard does happens in front of witnesses that aren't under Vane's authority. Rook looked at her for 1 second. Then he moved. She turned to Kael. The warden is 20 minutes out. I need him on the south road. If Vane's guard tries to pull the perimeter units through the southern approach, I'll get him the route. Go. Kael went. She turned to the camp, to the 1,500 people looking at her in the early gray light, the horn still sounding in the east, the pine forest and the garrison road and the ridge and everything she'd built in this territory surrounding her on all sides. She thought about what Darius had looked like across the command tent table, reading the documents with the specific, focused attention of a man relearning something he'd thought he understood. The quality of the moment when he'd said he used me, not as an accusation of anyone else, but as a recognition of what he'd been inside of, what it cost to say that out loud. She knew something about that particular cost. She didn't know what happened after this morning. She didn't know whether the evidence held up under the political pressure Vane would apply to it. She didn't know whether the garrison commander's refusal would stand, or whether Vane's personal authority would override it before Darius arrived. She didn't know whether Aldrich Morn reached the south road in time, or whether Rook's 20 people got to the eastern perimeter before the guard did. She knew what she was doing right now. That was enough. She looked at the faces in front of her. We move northwest, she said. All of us. We get between Vane and the garrison before he finishes closing the ring. If he wants to classify this network as enemy combatants, he's going to have to do it with 1,500 people standing in front of the Alpha King while he tries. Nobody spoke. Then Brant, who'd been in the Eastern Territory for 12 years and had seen 7 people with big ideas come and go, picked up his coat. Move, he said to the camp. She said northwest. The camp moved. And somewhere on the garrison road, 2 miles northwest, Cassius Vane stood inside the command building with his signed authorization and his personal guard and his years of patience and precision and his absolute certainty that he had arranged every piece of this correctly. And he had not yet been told that the woman he'd exiled into disposability was coming toward him through the gray dawn light with 1,500 people at her back and 3 years of evidence in her coat and absolutely nothing left to lose. The garrison road at dawn looked like the end of something. Serafina led 1,500 people out of the eastern pine forest and onto the open ground north of the garrison walls as the sun came over the ridge, and for a moment, just one, before the calculation resumed, she let herself see it the way someone watching from outside might see it, the light hitting the frost on the grass, the column of people stretching back into the tree line, not a military formation, not a mob, just people moving with shared purpose in the specific early quiet of a morning that hadn't decided yet what it was going to be. Families and fighters and former nobles and people who'd been born in the open territory and never known anything else, and all of them moving because she'd said northwest and Brant had said move, and the thing she'd spent 3 years building had proven, at the moment that mattered, that it was real. The garrison's outer gate was closed. 2 of Vane's personal guards stood at it. She could see the difference in their kit, private retainer colors under the blackthorn crest, the specific configuration of men who answered to a lord rather than to a command structure. They saw the column emerging from the tree line, and one of them moved toward the gate's interior mechanism. "Don't," she said, her voice carried in the cold air. Not raised, flat and certain. The guard stopped, assessed, looked at the column behind her. She walked to within 20 feet of the gate and stopped. Tell Cassius Vane that Serafina Voss is outside the garrison with 1,500 people and she's waiting for Alpha King Darius Blackthorn to arrive and settle this directly. She looked at the guard who'd moved. You have about 10 minutes before that happens. Use them however you think is best." The guard looked at his partner. Something passed between them that was the specific communication of two men calculating odds. The gate stayed closed. She turned and looked at the column. Rook was somewhere on the eastern perimeter. She trusted that, trusted him. The warden was coming up the south road. She trusted that too. Kyle was 10 feet behind her right shoulder, had been the whole way from camp and didn't need to be told anything. She waited. The sound of horses came from the northwest road 7 minutes later. Fast, multiple. The advance party, Darius, and behind them, the sound that changed the texture of the morning entirely. A voice she recognized at volume, issuing commands she could hear but not parse, and then the garrison's inner gate mechanism engaging from the inside, and the gate opening not because Vane's guards had opened it, but because someone with garrison authority had overridden them. Garrison Commander Vanek, she'd know his name by reputation only, had never met him, stood in the gap with 6 garrison soldiers behind him and looked at the column of 1,500 people on his road with an expression that combined profound exhaustion with something that might have been relief. "Lord Vane's guard is contained in the command building," he said. He was talking to her, not to Vane's guards. "I've been holding the authorization refusal for 3 hours. I need someone with actual crown authority to confirm the counterman before my command structure fractures." "That's coming," she said. "How long do you have?" 20 minutes, maybe 30. After that, some of my people start weighing personal risk." She looked at the northwest road. The hoofbeats were closer. Darius came through the garrison's outer approach at a canter and pulled up hard when he saw the column. She watched him take it in. The 1,500 people, the open gate, Vanek in the gap, her standing 20 feet from the gate with Kyle behind her. His eyes moved across all of it with the fast assessment she recognized, the one she'd watched him do in War Council briefings when the information was coming in faster than the framework could handle. He looked at her. "Vane's guard?" he said. "Contained in the command building," she said. "Garrison commander has held the authorization refusal. You have a window." He was off the horse before she finished the sentence. What happened in the next 40 minutes was not dramatic. That was the thing about the resolution of plans that had been building for years. The actual moment of it was almost always administrative rather than spectacular. A series of decisions and countermands and formal recordings that looked, from the outside, like paperwork. Darius walked into the garrison command building with Edrin and 2 of the Royal Advance Guard. Vanek walked in behind them. She stayed outside with the column because the column was still the most important thing she had. 1,500 people on that road, visible from every point of the garrison, was the reason Vane's guard hadn't moved and the reason Vanek had held. She heard raised voices from inside. Vane's voice she recognized, controlled, measured, the tone of a man who still believed the architecture around him was sound. Darius's voice she couldn't hear clearly, only the rhythm of it, short, flat, final. Kale stood beside her. "You're doing the thing where you're not feeling anything," Kale said quietly. "I'm feeling it," Serafina said. "I'm just filing it. You should let some of it out. Later. You always say later. Later has always worked so far." Kyle made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. The doors opened 40 minutes after Darius had walked in. 2 of Vanek's garrison soldiers came out first, and between them, Cassius Vane walked into the morning light with his hands not quite at his sides, a constraint she recognized as the specific posture of someone restrained by instruction rather than by anything physical. His personal guard followed, disarmed. He looked at the 1,500 people on the garrison road. He looked at her. She'd spent 3 years thinking about what she would feel when this moment came. She'd expected the specific heat of vindication, the feeling of a thing returning to its correct configuration after years of distortion. What she felt instead was quieter. Not satisfaction exactly, something more like the absence of a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped registering it as weight. He looked at her the way you looked at something that had gone further than you'd calculated it could go, with the specific expression of a man whose precision had been out-precised. There was no fear in it, not yet. Just the adjustment, the recalculation. "Serafina Voss," he said. "Lord Vane," she said. A long moment. The morning light. The column behind her. the garrison soldiers at his back. "You should have died in the eastern territories," he said. Not viciously, almost conversationally, the tone of a man noting an error in his own work. "A lot of people said that," she said. "I found it motivating." Darius came through the doors behind Vane. He stopped when he saw her face. Read something in it and didn't speak yet, which was the right call, and she noted it. The formal charge process took 3 days. She wasn't involved in most of it. That was Idrin's domain and Vonek's, and the 2 noble council members Darius recalled from the capital once Aldrin Thatch's testimony was formally entered into the record. She spent those 3 days at the garrison and in the surrounding camps because 1,500 people who'd marched through the night on the word of their leader deserved that leader's presence while they waited to understand what the marching had actually accomplished. She slept, finally, on the second night. Properly. 6 hours in a garrison-assigned room that was the first actual bed she'd used in 3 years, and she woke from it feeling something she couldn't immediately name, a lightness that turned out, on examination, to be the simple, unfamiliar quality of a body that had been carrying emergency readiness for 36 consecutive months and had briefly set it down. Aldrich Morn, the warden, who she was learning to call by his actual name, arrived at the garrison on the second day with 40 of his people and the specific quality of a man who'd been living under a different assumed name long enough that answering to Aldrich required a half-second adjustment. "My father knows I'm alive," he said when she found him in the garrison's outer yard. "Hector Morn," she said. "He sent a message through one of Darius's riders." He looked at the garrison walls. 6 years. He thought I was dead. He paused. He didn't fight Vane's expulsion. I told myself for 6 years that was the thing I'd never be able to get past. She waited. "I got past it," he said. "I don't know when. Maybe when I had enough distance to understand that a man choosing to protect himself in an impossible situation isn't the same thing as a man choosing wrong." He looked at her. "You understand that logic." She thought about Davon, his daughter, the 3 weeks of carrying what he'd done before the partial attempt at repair. "Yes," she said. "I understand it." The formal charges against Cassius Vane were presented on the 3rd day in the garrison's main assembly room, which was large enough for the senior leadership she'd assembled, her own, Aldrich's, Vonek's garrison officers, and the 2 recalled council members who'd traveled from the capital with the speed of people who understood the political weather was changing and wanted to be on the right side of the change. Darius presided. She sat at the assembly table, which was the first time she'd been in a formal crown proceeding since the Thornwall courtyard. The difference was specific and exact. She was sitting at the table rather than standing on a dais being sentenced, and the evidence on the table was hers. Vane sat across from her. He'd spent 3 days in garrison custody, and he still looked contained. She'd expected that. The kind of man who built what he'd built over years of patient precision didn't collapse under 3 days of confinement. He was regrouping, calculating what remained available to him, assessing the configuration for a path that minimized damage. She'd been watching him do it. He had no path. She'd been thorough. But she understood why he was still looking. Darius read the formal charges aloud. The financial records connecting Vane's house to the rogue elements used to construct her frame. The expulsion of Aldrich Morn by engineered land dispute. The forced removal of garrison commander Fell. The coercion operation targeting Davon's family. The unauthorized forward deployment of the military authorization. Darius read this one with a particular flatness that was, she knew, as close as he was going to come to public acknowledgement of his own role in being manipulated. When Darius finished reading, he set the document down. "Lord Vane," he said, "the council has reviewed the evidence. Do you have anything to present in response?" Vane looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up, directly at Darius, with the expression of a man making one final calculation and deciding it doesn't change anything. "I served the realm," he said. "Everything I did was in service of crown stability." "By deciding which people the crown could afford to lose," Darius said. "Someone always decides that." Vane's voice was completely even. "I made it efficient." The assembly room was very quiet. She looked at Vane across the table and felt it clearly for the first time. Not anger, not satisfaction, something more complicated. The recognition that men like Vane were not aberrations but logical extensions of a specific kind of institutional logic, the kind that measured human beings by their utility to power and disposed of them when the calculus shifted. He hadn't done what he'd done from cruelty. He'd done it from a coherent, terrible efficiency, which was, in some ways, harder to hate and more important to dismantle. The council finds the charges proven, Darius said. Lord Cassius Vane is stripped of title, land holdings, and all noble standing, effective immediately. He is remanded to formal custody pending full legal disposition of his actions against the crown and the individuals he directly harmed. Vane said nothing. He looked at nothing in particular. The specific expression of a man setting down something he'd carried for so long it no longer had weight. The garrison soldiers came for him and he went without resistance. The assembly room emptied slowly. She stayed at the table after most people had left. Darius stayed too. They were alone for the first time since the command tent 2 days ago, and the quality of that aloneness was different from two people exchanging tactical information in an emergency. It was just two people in a room after the emergency had resolved, with everything that predated the emergency still present and unaddressed. He sat across from her. Not at the head of the table. Across. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need to say it without the framework of what just happened, making it sound like it's about what just happened." She waited. "I believe the charges," he said, 3 years ago. "I want to be precise about that. It wasn't that I didn't trust you and the charges confirmed my doubt. I trusted you. And then the charges came with evidence and Vane's presentation and the council's unanimity, and I—" He stopped, looked at his hands on the table. "I chose the framework around you over the knowledge of you, and I told myself that was what it meant to be a king." She sat with that. "It wasn't," he said. "It was what it meant to be afraid of what the truth would require of me." The morning light was coming through the assembly room's high windows now. She looked at his face in it, older, as she'd registered at the advance camp, carrying something that had been there for a while. She understood now that the something was this, not guilt exactly, but its more productive cousin, the specific knowledge of having been wrong in a way that had weight, and being unwilling to put it down because putting it down meant stop accounting for it. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I knew it for a long time," she said. "Not that you'd made the wrong call. I knew that immediately. I mean that I understood why you made it. The institutional pressure, the council unanimity, the way Vane had built the frame to leave you no visible alternative." She paused. "Understanding why someone does a thing doesn't fix the thing they did. But it changed what I was carrying." "What were you carrying?" he said. "For the first year, mostly fury." She said it plainly. Then something quieter. The specific grief of understanding that someone I trusted completely was capable of trusting the room more than me, and that there was nothing I could have done to change that outcome because the mechanism that produced it existed before I was ever in the room. "Vane," he said. "Vane was the instrument. The mechanism is older." She looked at the table. "The assumption that power requires the disposal of people who become inconvenient. He didn't invent that. He was very good at it." A long silence. "What are you going to do?" Darius said. "After this?" She thought about it the way she thought about questions that deserved actual answers rather than diplomatic ones. "Finish what I started," she said. "The network in the Eastern Territories isn't a wartime configuration. It's a functional state that's been running as an emergency measure for 3 years. It needs real infrastructure, proper medical systems, educational access, dispute resolution that doesn't rely on one person's judgment. It needs to stop being a thing people fled to and start being a thing people can choose." She paused. "That's going to take longer than 3 years." He was watching her face, the careful attention she remembered from the War Council sessions, the one that meant he was learning something and taking it seriously. "The territorial boundaries," he said. "What you've built extends past the current crown jurisdiction lines." "Yes?" "That's not a problem if we redraw the lines," he said. "The Eastern Territories have been ungoverned by choice, not by necessity. The Crown stopped investing in them 30 years ago because Vane's family had land interests in keeping them unstable." She looked at him. "You've read the financial records." "Idrin went through all of it last night." He paused. 30 years of manufactured instability in the Eastern Territories, used to justify ongoing military positioning that served Vane's land interests. And everyone inside the crown accepted it because it was profitable for enough of them not to question it. He let that sit. I accepted it because I inherited it, and Vane presented it as fact. The garrison commander, she said. Vanek. He's solid, trustworthy, and independent enough to refuse an authorization he knew was wrong. He's also been working within a system that gave him bad information for years. He needs support and actual intelligence about the territory he's responsible for. I know. He looked at her steadily. I'm asking you to help build that. The weight of the moment was specific and exact, not romantic. She wasn't going to reach for that word. Not today, not in this room with 3 years and Cassius Vane and everything that had happened between the Thornwall courtyard and this table still present and requiring acknowledgement rather than resolution. But something real. The recognition between two people who'd been on opposite sides of a catastrophic mistake and had come through it to a place where the catastrophe was understood well enough to build differently. I'll help build that, she said, not because of what existed before, because of what needs to exist now. He nodded, slow and without performance. What does that look like? He said. It looks like the network I've already built, formally recognized and properly resourced. It looks like Aldrich Morn, with legitimate standing to manage Eastern territorial affairs, rather than doing it as a stateless operator. It looks like Vanek reporting to a command structure that includes people who actually know the territory. She looked at her hands on the table. And it looks like the 340 families who came to the South Road yesterday, having a guarantee that their status in this realm is never again subject to the political convenience of someone like Vane. Done, he said. She looked at him. Not as a gesture, he said, as a structural commitment, written into the territorial charter revision, non-revocable by Crown alone, requiring dual consent from the Eastern Territorial Administration. He paused. Which means you. She sat with that, the specific weight of it, the thing she'd built in the dark being formally recognized in the light, not because she'd asked for recognition, but because it had grown large enough and real enough that recognition was the only honest response to it. I need 30 days, she said, to bring the full network leadership into a governing structure that can actually hold the responsibility. I'm not accepting a formal position that my people haven't agreed to through a real process. He accepted that without argument. She stood. He stood. They were the same height. She'd always registered that. Unusual for a man with his particular kind of authority, the kind that made rooms feel physically compressed. She looked at him directly in the morning light from the high windows. Darius, she said. His name, just his name, the first time she'd said it since the Thornwall courtyard. Yes, he said. What you said in the command tent, about what it cost you to understand what you'd been inside of. She chose the words with care. I want you to know that I heard it, and I believe you meant it. He held her gaze. Something in his face was very still and very open at the same time. It's not forgiveness, she said. Not yet. Forgiveness isn't a thing I have to give you all at once in a moment. It's a thing that happens or doesn't happen over time based on what the time looks like. She paused. But I'm not carrying the Thornwall courtyard the way I was carrying it when I left it. 3 years changed that. What I built changed that. She let him see it clearly. Not absolution, but the genuine absence of the specific fury that could have made the rest of this impossible. That's where I am. He took a slow breath, set it down, whatever he'd been holding. That's more than I expected, he said, and exactly what I needed to hear. She nodded. Then she walked to the assembly room door and opened it, and outside the garrison was running its morning operations in the early light. And across the yard, Kael was talking to one of Aldrich's people with her arms crossed and her head tilted at the specific angle that meant she was skeptical but listening. And somewhere in the eastern camps, 1,500 people were waking up in territory that was going to be different from now on, not because a battle had been won in the spectacular way of stories, but because the slow work of 3 years had compounded into something too real to dismiss. She stood in the doorway and let herself breathe. Not victory exactly. Something steadier. The particular quality of a thing completed. Not finished in the sense of done, because the work was nowhere near done, but completed in the sense of having reached the shape it was always moving toward. The woman who'd walked out of the Thornwall courtyard counting steps had not been walking away. She'd been walking toward this. She just hadn't known the distance yet. Cale saw her and crossed the yard. "Well," Cale said. "Vane's been formally charged. The territorial charter revision starts in 30 days. She looked at the garrison walls and the sky above them, clear and cold, and the specific blue of a morning that had stopped being a crisis. "We have work to do." Cale looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone who'd been at her shoulder through 3 years of hard country and knew every version of her face. "You're okay," Cale said. Not a question. "I'm okay," she said. Cale nodded once, satisfied in the specific way of people who don't require elaboration when the truth is plainly visible. They walked together into the garrison yard, and the morning opened in front of them, and the work that needed doing was enormous and immediate and exactly the kind of work that required the people who knew how to do it, not the ones who'd inherited the authority to attempt it, but the ones who'd built themselves into the capacity for it through the specific hard education of having been left with nothing and discovering what nothing actually contained. The Eastern Territories were not a wound anymore. They were a foundation. Serafina Voss had been exiled into them to die, and she'd spent 3 years building them into something the realm was going to have to learn to reckon with. Not the woman who'd stood on the obsidian dais and been stripped of everything. Someone who'd been built from those pieces and several 100,000 harder ones since, into a shape that the Thornwall courtyard had not been able to imagine, and Cassius Vane had not been able to account for, and even Darius Blackthorn, who'd known her, had underestimated. That was the thing about what survived being discarded. It came back knowing exactly what it was made of, and nothing made from that knowledge. No scheme, no authorization, no court of serene men with signed documents and patient plans. Nothing made from the outside could touch it. She walked into the morning. The realm's new chapter began without ceremony, the way real things always did. Not in the spectacular light of a single moment, but in the steady accumulation of days that knew where they were going and went.